3 years. That's how long Ukraine has been fighting off Russia's brutal invasion. But February 24, 2025 isn't just an anniversary, it was a turning point. With US President Donald Trump back in office, the world is watching to see what happens next. Will the US continue to back Ukraine? Or is Europe about to be left to stand against Russia alone? One thing's for sure, Europe isn't waiting to find out. The continent is preparing for the worst, and the message is clear. If Russia wants a fight, Europe is ready. So what's the plan? How does Europe intend to counter the Russian threat? And what happens if the US steps back? Let's start with the historic meeting in Kyiv, where Europe's leaders made one thing certain: they're not backing down. The scene in Kyiv on the third anniversary of the invasion was nothing short of electric. 13 of the most powerful Western leaders gathered in the Ukrainian capital to send a bold message. The Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky welcomed them with open arms. There was no sign of President Trump, but his shadow loomed large. You could feel it in the air as European leaders subtly rebuked the rhetoric coming out of Washington and doubled down on their commitment to Ukraine's sovereignty. Among the guests were heavyweights like Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the European Commission. Trudeau even took a clear jab at Trump by calling Zelensky a duly elected Democratic leader. He was of course referencing Trump's shocking Truth social media post in which he labeled the Ukrainian president a dictator without elections. Despite these words, leaders from Spain, Latvia, Estonia and Finland, all nations that know the cost of Russian aggression, stood shoulder to shoulder with Zelensky. And let's not forget about the 24 leaders who joined virtually, sending a powerful message to the world: Europe will always find a way to come together. Its unity is a force that surpasses borders, both literal and digital. But this meeting was no symbolic gesture. The West came ready to act. Zelensky's call for a strong security guarantee was met with swift action. A whopping $21 billion could be on the table for Ukraine's next aid package. A lifeline for a nation under siege. European foreign ministers meeting in Brussels just hours before were already hashing out the details. Throw a fresh round of sanctions targeting Russian energy, trade, transport, and financial services into the mix, and one thing becomes clear: Europe isn't going to let Russia operate with impunity, and this is just the beginning. On March 6th, 27 European leaders will meet again in Brussels for an emergency summit with one focus: securing the future of Ukraine and Europe. European Council President Antonio Costa said it best: "We are living in a defining moment for Ukraine and European security. For Europe, the time to act is now." With leaders from every corner of the continent coming together, Russia's playbook of aggression is facing an unbreakable front, and this time, there's no room for retreat, only forward momentum. But what exactly is Europe up against? Let's first quantify the Russian threat before diving into how Europe plans to dismantle it. Now, one look at daily reports coming from the General Staff of the Ukrainian Armed Forces could easily have you believing that Russia was no longer a serious threat. Just take a look at the February 25, 2025 report detailing the losses in 3 years of the invasion. In 3 years, Russia lost 869,530 troops in Ukraine. This staggering figure includes killed, wounded, missing, and captured soldiers. If we're talking fatalities only, around 165,000 Russian troops have been killed since the launch of the invasion, according to independent Russian media outlets Medusa and Mediazona. The situation with equipment losses is equally dire. Here's an overview done by the General Staff of the Ukrainian Armed Forces. In 3 years, Russia reportedly lost 10,182 tanks, 21,168 armored fighting vehicles, 38,582 vehicles and fuel tanks, 23,652 artillery systems, 1,299 multiple launch rocket systems, 1,083 air defense systems, 370 airplanes, 331 helicopters, 26,767 drones, 28 ships and boats, and 1 submarine. That's more firepower than some countries even have in their entire military arsenal. But these losses also make you wonder, why is Europe even afraid of Russia? The country seems to be on a downward spiral that's almost impossible to stop. Well, that's just the thing. The key word here is almost. Time and time again, Russia has shown a remarkable ability to absorb staggering losses and keep pushing forward. This is what's happening now, too. Despite all the losses, Russia isn't backing down. In fact, it's building up its forces at an alarming rate. You see, Russia invaded Ukraine with 169,000 to 190,000 troops in 2022. By the end of 2024, the Russian military presence in Ukraine ballooned to an impressive 700,000 soldiers. That's roughly 4 times the size of the entire military force Russia had on the border before the war even began. And it's not just about troops. Russia is also ramping up its defense production like a war machine in overdrive. In 2024 alone, the country produced and refurbished 1,550 tanks, 5,700 armored vehicles, and 450 artillery pieces. That's an increase of up to 220% in tank production and 150% in armored vehicles compared to 2022. Russia is also churning out long-range loitering munitions at a staggering pace, with a 435% increase in production of Lancet drones, designed to strike from over 30 miles away. These drones once relied on Iranian support. Now they're a key part of Russia's domestic arsenal, and their numbers are only growing. The same goes for the number of attacks. In May 2024 alone, Russia launched over 300 Lancet attacks, nearly doubling the previous month's total. With more troops, more advanced weaponry, and a relentless drive to recover from its losses, Russia is showing the world that its appetite for aggression is far from satisfied. It's clear that Russia's President Vladimir Putin isn't just after Ukraine. He has a thirst for dominance that won't stop until Europe is under his thumb. And this brings us to why Europe is consolidating its forces so urgently. The continent isn't just preparing to defend Ukraine, it's gearing up for a Europe versus Russia confrontation. And this confrontation isn't some hypothetical scenario, it's a very real possibility that's growing more imminent by the day. In fact, Russia could be ready to launch an all-out attack on Europe within 5 years, according to a report by Denmark's Defense Intelligence Service, DDIS. The report singled out the US involvement as a key factor in this timeline. If Washington goes through with pulling back its support, this will surely embolden Russia. If Russia assesses the US cannot or will not support the European NATO countries, the report warns, Russia is likely to be more willing to use military force. This means that the clock is ticking. But European leaders are already preparing for this reality. That's because assessments from NATO, Germany, Poland, Denmark, and the Baltic states all point to a similar timeline, with Russia potentially being ready to strike within 3 to 10 years. Though we're lucky if Russia even waits for that long. The Zapad 2025 military exercises, set to take place in Belarus, could provide an early warning of Russia's true intentions. And those intentions are looking more aggressive by the day. We'll let the facts speak for themselves. Russia and Belarus are preparing for some of the largest military exercises in years, involving around 13,000 soldiers, massive amounts of military equipment, and a clear message of readiness. Zapad 2025 will showcase Russia's ability to manage large-scale military operations, even in the midst of an ongoing conflict. It's one thing to hold an exercise during peacetime, it's another to demonstrate such capabilities while also fighting a war. This sends a strong message that Russia is gearing up for more than just regional conflicts, it's preparing for a larger confrontation. The scale of these exercises is staggering. To put it into perspective, Zapad 2021, the last major iteration, saw the deployment of over 80 aircraft and more than 760 pieces of military equipment, including more than 290 tanks and 240 artillery units. Some of these exercises were held near the Polish border, which was another clear message to NATO. While the specific equipment for Zapad 2025 hasn't been fully disclosed yet, we can expect to see a similar arsenal, including advanced systems like the S-300 and S-400 surface-to-air missile systems, T-72B3 tanks, and Su-30 multi-role fighter jets. The truth is that these exercises could be the prelude for something far worse. Russian officials have emphasized that they are preparing for modern threats, and they've even been analyzing captured NATO equipment to identify weaknesses for future exploitation. That's a chilling sign. So what is Europe planning to do about all this? Let's break it down. First and foremost, Europe wants to continue supporting Ukraine. After all, Ukraine's experienced military is currently the most effective deterrent against a Russian attack on the European Union. The longer Ukraine holds strong, the more it buys time for Europe to fortify its defenses. That's why Europe must also be prepared to fully replace the US aid if Trump does decide to pull the plug. And that's precisely what Europe plans to do: step up and pick up the slack. In reality, Europe could fully replace US aid without breaking a sweat. Since the start of the war in February 2022, the US has allocated or committed a total of roughly $180 billion to support Ukraine, and Europe's total allocations and commitments during the same period amount to about $150 billion. If we're just talking about donated military aid, the US has provided about $66.5 billion, while European nations have contributed approximately $39 billion. To match total US aid contributions, Europe would need to increase its spending by approximately 0.12% of its GDP, a very manageable amount. That's not even a blip on the radar for the EU economy. In other words, even with all the challenges that come with this, Europe has the financial means to fill the gap, especially in military spending. Sure, the real concern will be access to the US military-industrial base, since Europe doesn't produce the same cutting-edge technology and military equipment in the same quantities. But the funds are there. Europe's spending on military aid is already on par with US support, and the EU has spent $21 billion more than the US on humanitarian and financial aid combined. But what about defending the whole continent? Or at least countries that Russia is more likely to attack? Well, that's where things get a bit trickier, but it's nothing Europe can't handle. When meeting Trump for a joint press conference in Washington in late February 2025, French President Emmanuel Macron made it clear that Europe was ready to step up its defenses to build a long-lasting peace. Here's how Europe plans to defend its territories from Russia. Increasing the number of troops is the first order of business. For decades after the Cold War, European militaries shrank significantly. Many countries now only possess what NATO officials call a bonsai army, an army that's too small to fundamentally protect its own country. For example, the British army is now at its smallest size since the Battle of Waterloo. The German army, long underfunded, is still struggling to rebuild, needing at least 40,000 more soldiers just to reach minimum readiness. But the problem doesn't lie only in numbers. Readiness must be better too. Jim Townsend, the former US Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, put it bluntly: European armies are too small to handle even the arms that they've got now. Without sufficient combat troops, no amount of modern weaponry will matter. And Europe needs a force equivalent to 300,000 combat-ready US troops to effectively deter Russia. Those are the current estimates. That means that building around 50 new brigades of mechanized and armored forces capable of operating in Eastern Europe's demanding battlefield conditions. Europe doesn't currently have those numbers. Even a force of 200,000 might be out of reach with current recruitment levels. So for now, Europe is aiming at a deterrent force. This force would have to be about 100,000 soldiers strong, soldiers assigned to the mission at all times, rotating in and out to maintain readiness. 100,000 is also the current number of American troops stationed in Europe, but this number is expected to fall in the coming years. This figure of 100,000 troops also matches part of NATO's rapid reinforcement strategy. The NATO force model, agreed upon in 2022, aims to make 300,000 high-readiness troops available for deployment, with 100,000 of them ready to move within 10 days. The full force should be deployable within 30 days. To reach this goal, the alliance is pre-positioning equipment and stockpiles, expanding air and missile defense systems, and integrating new members like Finland and Sweden into strategic planning. NATO has also been making moves to strengthen its eastern defenses, the side of the alliance that borders Russia. Since 2017, multinational battle groups have been deployed in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland, with additional forces stationed in Bulgaria, Hungary, Romania, and Slovakia after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. That's effectively doubled NATO's presence on its eastern flank, with troops from multiple countries training and operating together. At the 2022 Madrid summit, NATO members committed to increasing these battle groups from battalion size to brigade size where needed. Latvia became the first country to make this jump in 2024, and others are expected to follow. Although Europe still has a long way to go, it's more than willing to make the journey. After all, what's the alternative? Hoping Russia never decides to attack another European country? That's not a strategy. That's wishful thinking with a side of denial. So Europe is basically hoping for the best, but preparing for the worst. This also includes working on its military coordination. After all, if Europe manages to accumulate a force of 300,000, we're looking at troops coming from over 30 national armies. That's a logistical nightmare waiting to happen. It's like trying to assemble a Super Bowl winning crew using players from 30 different teams, each with their own playbook and slightly different rules of the game. If nobody's on the same page, you don't get a team, you get chaos. That's why military coordination isn't just important, it's the difference between a functional army and a bureaucratic nightmare with guns. Right now, Europe has more than 1.4 million active duty personnel spread across different national armies. The US can almost match this number on its own, but again, it's not about the numbers, it's about how well those troops work together. If Europe wants to replace the US troops in Europe successfully, it must develop tighter command structures, improve interoperability, and ensure that when those forces deploy, they function like a single, cohesive unit, not a patchwork of different national strategies. NATO's current assumption is that the Supreme Allied Commander Europe is always a top US general. But this only works when the US is leading the charge. If Trump decides to step back, Europe has to be ready to take control of its own defense without waiting for marching orders from Washington. And that's exactly why NATO's latest military exercises are more than just a show of force. They're a test run for a future where Europe can't rely on the US as its security backstop. As steadfast dart 2025 plays out across Romania, Bulgaria, and Greece, Europe is getting a hard look at what it might mean to lead from the front, just as US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth suggested. With 10,000 troops from 9 nations, live fire drills, and cyber warfare components, NATO is trying to prove that it can rapidly deploy a large-scale force without waiting for Washington's green light. Next up, military equipment and production. Europe is gearing up for a serious transformation in this area as well. History shows that when the pressure is on, market economies can deliver. Just look at West Germany under Chancellor Helmut Schmidt. It modernized its military in no time to counter Soviet forces. Now the challenge is even bigger, but so is the determination to meet it head-on. To build a credible deterrence force capable of stopping a Russian breakthrough in the Baltics, Europe needs numbers, big numbers. According to Bruegel, a respected European think tank, Europe needs at least 1,400 tanks, 2,000 infantry fighting vehicles, and 700 artillery pieces for this purpose. Right now, that's more firepower than France, Germany, Italy, and the UK combined. And that's before we even get to the ammunition problem. Europe needs a minimum of 1,150mm shells just to sustain 90 days of high-intensity combat. Of course, it's not just about tanks and shells. Modern warfare is about speed, intelligence, and adaptability. In practice, this means scaling up drone production to match Russia, which requires at least 2,000 long-range loitering munitions per year. It means boosting aviation, transport, missile defense, and electronic warfare capabilities. Of course, buying from the US is always an option. European arms purchases helped drive US defense exports to a record $318.7 billion in 2024. That's great for NATO cohesion, but if Europe wants true strategic autonomy, it needs to start building at home. The good news is that Europe has the industrial capacity to do this. It just needs to mobilize it. Take Germany's defense company Helsing as an example. It's already mass-producing AI-enabled drones, cranking out over 1,000 HX-2 strike drones per month. With orders from Ukraine totaling 10,000 units across 2 models, Helsing is proving that Europe's defense industry can scale up when needed. More companies following this model could bring Europe to drone parity with Russia in record time. The final aspect Europe needs is money. We've already discussed the funds Europe is pouring into Ukraine's defense, but what about its own? Currently, European NATO countries contribute around 2% of their GDP to defense. As a reminder, this is NATO's floor, not the ceiling. For Europe to seriously bolster its defenses, experts suggest that a more sustainable target will be around 3% to 3.5% of GDP. A $262 billion increase in defense spending annually is the current estimation of what Europe should aim for to fully cover its defense needs in the short term. Now, this sounds like a hefty price tag, and let's be honest, it is. However, it's also within reach. All Europe needs is a blend of national and EU-level investments. For the next 5 years, Europe should raise roughly $130 billion at the EU level. Germany alone is projected to cover at least half of that amount, increasing its overall defense spending by 3 to 4 billion euros annually over the next 15 years. A bright spot in this fiscal journey is the economic potential of defense spending. Investing in defense could significantly contribute to European economic activity. Think innovation, job creation, and industrial growth. Just take the example of large-scale production orders. Buying in bulk significantly drives down unit costs. Look at Germany's recent order of 105 Leopard 2 tanks at $3.14 billion. If Europe orders the required 1,400 tanks, prices will drop as production scales up. This could save billions in the long run. Now, we keep mentioning Germany for a reason. If it plays its cards right, this country could help fortify the entire European continent. It would ensure that nations like Poland and the Baltic states, likely Putin's next targets after Ukraine, can count on reliable support against the incoming threats. But what does playing its cards right mean in this context? Well, for starters, Germany must overcome its past inefficiencies in procurement and military readiness. It must also increase its defense spending to 3.5% of GDP and ensure its defense sector is fully equipped and prepared. Of course, this won't be an overnight fix, but Germany, like the rest of Europe, is waking up to the realization that its security depends not just on pledges, but on actionable investment. The days of pushing defense spending into the background are long gone. Europe is now heading straight for the crucial challenge ahead. The good news is that it has the money, industry, and motivation to also overcome that challenge, to outmatch anything Russia can throw at it, to defeat it once and for all. But when do you see this clash happening? If you see it happening in the first place? And do you think Europe will have enough time to fortify its defenses if the US exits the continent? While you're there, let us know whether all European NATO countries combined can eventually match the US's contribution and successfully stand against Russia. If Ukraine falls, NATO will burn. That's the dire warning Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky delivered during an interview at the Munich Security Conference. His message was simple: Putin won't stop at Ukraine. He'll target the rest of Europe next, and he may even be able to do it without the United States getting involved. Putin is waiting for NATO to be weakened, and Russia's leader cannot be trusted. But why does Zelensky think that Russia wants a war against NATO? What would allow that war to happen? And what would the outcome of that war actually be? We start with Zelensky's comments. As Ukraine's president spoke to reporters in Munich, he pointed out that US President Donald Trump has the leverage to push Putin towards ceasefire negotiations. However, Putin can't be trusted. Even if he comes to the table with Ukraine involved, he still has expansionist desires, and he might break the conditions of a truce at a moment's notice. If that happens, it will be a sign that Putin isn't ready to stop at Ukraine. The rest of Europe, which accounts for most of NATO, will be next. We believe that Putin will wage war against NATO, Zelensky told the reporters. In addition to suggesting that Russia's leader is waiting for a weakened NATO. How could NATO be weakened? By the possibility that the United States of America will think to take its military from Europe. Zelensky's warning is twofold. Europe can't trust Putin to keep his word, and it can't rely on the United States to come to its rescue should Putin look beyond Ukraine. I don't know if they will want 30% of Europe, 50%, I don't know. Nobody knows, but they will have this possibility, said Ukraine's leader when referring to a situation in which Ukraine falls and the United States isn't around to help. The words echoed those Zelensky spoke at the Munich Security Conference itself, where he told Europe's leaders that we can't rule out the possibility that America might say no to Europe on issues that threaten it. So it appears that we have two conditions that must be met if Russia is to wage war on NATO. First, the US must either withdraw from the alliance or refuse to aid its NATO partners, even if a Russian invasion triggers Article 5 of the NATO Charter. Second, Putin must have the desire to claim more of Europe if he's successful in Ukraine. The question now is simple: could those two conditions be met? The short answer is yes. It's a possibility that Russia could wage war on Europe and the US wouldn't intervene. Starting with the weakening of NATO, the concept of Trump removing the US from the coalition is far from new. Back in 2018, during Trump's first stint as US president, Trump reportedly told senior administration officials several times that he desired the removal of the US from NATO. Those statements included claims that Trump didn't see the point of maintaining such a large military alliance, especially as he believed that the existence of NATO was a drain on America's resources. A year before, Trump had also started telling NATO members that it was time to pay their way. During a NATO meeting in Brussels, he said that massive amounts of money were owed to the US by the other members of the coalition, while pointing out that many of NATO's members fall well short of the defense spending of 2% of gross domestic product, or GDP, that NATO recommends. And he was right. In 2017, only 4 nations were meeting what Trump believed was an obligation more than a recommendation. Those countries were Estonia, which spent 2.01% of its GDP on defense, Greece, with 2.38%, the UK, which spent 2.06%, and of course, the United States as the highest spender at 3.31%. At the time, NATO had 29 members, meaning less than 14% of its members were hitting the 2% recommendation. Trump's argument at the time seemed fairly simple: pay up or the US is gone. NATO has changed its tack. Fast forward to 2024 and NATO has expanded to include 32 members. Of those members, 23 are hitting the target of at least 2% of GDP spending on their defense. It's not a perfect record. Around 2/3 of NATO allies are hitting the target, but that's a lot better than the 14% or so of 2017, which would suggest that Trump was getting his way. America's NATO allies were starting to spend at similar levels, at least in terms of GDP, as the United States. The problem for Europe, and the reason why Zelensky is warning that Russia is preparing to wage war on NATO, is that Trump may not have changed his views on the US leaving the alliance. On February 14th, the UK Defense Journal reported on comments made by former US National Security Advisor John Bolton, who served under Trump during his first presidential term. He suggests that Trump is now moving the goalpost to keep the door open for the removal of the US from NATO. First, he said back in his initial term, well, all these Europeans are not spending 2% of GDP on defense. Now he's saying you need to spend 5% of GDP on defense, Bolton said. He's referring to comments made by Trump in early January 2025, when America's president claimed that NATO should have a 5% target. They can all afford it, said Trump, but they should be at 5%, not 2%. Note that Trump didn't say "we" here. He talked about NATO as a separate entity from the United States, acting as though all the other members should hit a new 5% target from which America is immune. The US also doesn't spend 5% of its GDP on defense either, with the country hitting 3.4% of GDP expenditure in 2024. That puts it about level with Estonia. also at 3.4% and quite a way behind Poland, which spent 4.1% of its GDP on its military. Bolton actually agrees with Trump's comments to an extent. He says that he believes the US itself isn't spending enough in a challenging world. However, he also points out that Trump's call for 5% may be an interesting goal. I suspect there's almost no country in Europe, maybe the Baltics and Poland and a few others, that will go to 5%. So in a year when it doesn't happen, Trump will be able to say, NATO is just as worthless as I always said it was, I'm getting out. In other words, Trump has moved the spending goalpost now so that more European NATO members are hitting the 2% target, and he's doing it because he sees it as a route for pulling the US out of the alliance. There's only one potential saving grace for NATO's European members. The US Congress stands as the guardrail that keeps America in the coalition. Any decision to leave has to first pass through Congress before it can be made a reality. Former US President Joe Biden signed that requirement into law as part of the 2024 National Defense Authorization Act, which may have been Biden's subtle way of preparing for the possibility of a Trump presidency. The problem is that the law isn't airtight. This is not open and shut, claims Brookings Institution scholar and senior editor of Lawfare Scott Anderson. This is about Congress telling you that you can't do this, and if you ignore Congress, you're going to have to fight us in the courts over it, he says. Therein lies the problem. For the issue to be litigated, Anderson claims, there needs to be someone with standing to sue. That someone could be Congress, only it's not clear if the Republicans in Congress would be willing to launch a lawsuit against their own elected president. So Zelensky is right to worry about NATO no longer having the US as a partner. Trump has threatened withdrawal in the past. He's moving the spending goalposts to a level that may be unreachable for many of the alliance's members. Plus, the laws in place to force congressional approval of a withdrawal aren't as solid as they need to be. But what about Putin? With NATO weakened by a US withdrawal, would he really set his sights on the rest of Europe? Again, it's a possibility. Suggestions that Putin's appetite for expansion may extend beyond Ukraine have existed since at least February 2023. That's when RAND published an article where it claimed that Putin's next goal may be to attack other post-Soviet neighbors who were previously part of Russia's empire. And Putin has a history in that respect. He invaded Georgia in 2008 soon after then Prime Minister Putin had told former US President George W. Bush that Ukraine is not even a country. Of course, Putin invaded Crimea in 2014, following that up with his special military operation against Ukraine in 2022. In the same year, he also claimed that Kazakhs never had statehood, but perhaps his most worrying claim came in 2016. Russia's president said that his country's border had no end. In May 2024, Philip Reeves of NPR's Morning Edition noted that many in Estonia fear Putin could target them next if he's victorious in Ukraine. Putin could seek to test NATO and Article 5 by entering the Baltics despite the risk of triggering nuclear war, claimed Reeves, noting that Estonians were protesting Putin's war in Ukraine outside the Russian embassy in Estonia's Tallinn at the time. It's also notable that about a quarter of Estonia's population are ethnic Russians, which could serve as ammunition for a future Putin claim that Estonia should be part of his country. The Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies also notes that Putin may be so hell-bent on expansion that he would invade European NATO nations even if the US remains part of the alliance. No one knows what Putin would do next if he were emboldened by a victory against Ukraine. And although analysts downplay the possibility of Putin attacking a Baltic state such as Estonia, Putin has surprised the world before. He did so when he invaded Ukraine. Worse yet, according to the Institute, Putin both dislikes NATO and doesn't fear an attack from the alliance. Rather, he's frustrated that NATO constrains him and prevents him from restoring what he sees as the true Russia. He's already engaged in hybrid warfare with many NATO countries, including using disinformation campaigns, sabotage, and cyber attacks to get his way. Would he go a step further and use military force? Perhaps if Russia defeats Ukraine and has a couple of years to rebuild its military capabilities, and if Trump has pulled the US out of NATO by then, the possibility of Putin following through on his expansionist desires becomes much higher. Ukraine certainly thinks that's a possibility. In October 2023, President Zelensky said that Putin is considering various scenarios for the coming years while highlighting 2028 as the potential year that Putin will attack a NATO-aligned nation. If Russia is allowed to adapt now, said Zelensky, then in 2028 the Kremlin will be able to restore the military potential Ukraine has destroyed, and Russia will have enough power to attack the countries that are the focus of Russian expansion. Like many before him, Zelensky highlighted the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania as being particularly at risk. This is clear information from our intelligence, and we signal it to you, Zelensky concluded. There's also the Trump factor to consider in all of this. Beyond the possibility that Trump may pull the US out of NATO, America's president has been sending some decidedly mixed messages to Ukraine over the last few weeks. Ukraine's president has had conversations with Trump during which he warned the US president that Putin is a liar. Putin doesn't want any peace, Zelensky told Trump. Ukraine's president also believes that Putin is a little bit scared of Trump, with that fear being potential leverage Trump could use to push Putin toward peace negotiations. The Kyiv Post also points out that US officials have assured Ukraine that America won't simply wash its hands of Ukraine's plight after it's spent 3 years battling against Russia. All of these seem like pro-Trump and pro-Ukraine messages, but on February 18th, Trump also held supposed peace talks with Putin in Saudi Arabia without any Ukrainian involvement. To Ukraine, that would look like the US attempting to cut them out of any deal that's being made, running contrary to the previous claims that America won't leave Ukraine behind. Trump was even quoted as being disappointed by Ukraine's reaction of surprise to not being invited to the talks, with Trump also saying that Zelensky could have made a deal earlier in the conflict. I hear that they're upset about not having a seat. Well, they've had a seat for 3 years and a long time before that. This could have been settled very easily. Trump even appeared to blame Ukraine for the conflict, adding, "You should have never started it. You could have made a deal." Is it any wonder that Zelensky is now warning NATO's European members that they face an imminent threat? Many believe that Putin wants to invade the Baltic states next, with Ukraine's own intelligence suggesting as much. Trump is sending mixed messages to Zelensky, and there's still the possibility that the US will withdraw from NATO to consider. If that happens, NATO's nuclear threat diminishes enormously, leaving only France and Britain as the nations capable of striking Russia with nukes, which would further open the door for a Russian war against what remains of NATO. The question now is simple. Is NATO ready for that war? It depends on who you ask. In June 2024, the UK Defence Journal stacked NATO without the US against Russia in an in-depth analysis. It pointed out that the combined strength of NATO's members without the US is far higher than Ukraine's when Russia invaded in February 2022. On the personnel front, NATO without America has 1.5 million active military personnel, which matches up well with the 1.32 million active soldiers Russia currently has. It's also worth noting that Russia has churned through over 862,000 troops in Ukraine, leaving it with a military predominantly made up of inexperienced conscripts, contract mercenaries, and even soldiers from other countries such as North Korea. NATO also has access to more advanced technology than Russia, the journal argues. Europe's NATO members have invested heavily in next-generation aircraft, cyber defenses, and precision-guided munitions, all of which make the collective a viable and powerful foe for Russia to take on. Of course, this also assumes that these NATO members will all respond with military force should Putin attack another NATO member, such as one of the Baltic states. However, this version of NATO would also miss the US dramatically. Its nuclear threat will be cut down, with France and Britain combining to have 515 nuclear warheads, compared to Russia's 1,549 strategic nukes and its remaining stockpile of 4,380. If Putin reaches for the nuclear button, he could devastate all NATO nations at once. France and Britain could do the same to Russia, though with less firepower than it would have if the US brought its 5,225 nuclear warheads to the engagement. European NATO also relies heavily on the US for operational intelligence and missile defense. Plus, America's large stockpile of aerial tankers would be missed, as these important aircraft are in short supply in Europe and would prove vital for keeping NATO's more powerful aerial forces refueled for assaults against Russia. The journal's conclusion is that NATO without the US could fend off a Russian attack well during the first few months, causing massive damage to Putin's forces. But what happens months down the line when Russia is still coming and NATO has depleted a large portion of its munitions? A February 2025 examination of the same topic by UK Defence Journal mentions the same issues. Again, the conclusion is that European NATO, and the continent as a whole, could mount a robust defence against Putin's forces. However, sustaining operations beyond the opening phases of such a war would see this America-less version of NATO struggle without the intelligence, logistical, and technical support the US has long provided. The NATO members that would be on the front lines in a war against Russia are even less confident. In December 2024, leaders from Latvia, Estonia, and Finland all made the same claim that NATO is not ready to fight against Russia without US involvement. "That's absolutely clear," said Latvian President Edgars Rinkēvičs. "We can't keep simply hoping for a situation where the US remains much involved in Europe." Estonian Prime Minister Kristen Michal added, "We have to ramp up our defense capabilities because of Russia's threat and its inability to be a democracy and operate in a rule-based world." It's worth noting that Estonia and Latvia spent 3.4% and 3.15% of their GDP on defense as of 2024. Finland has also broken through NATO's 2% target, spending 2.4% of its GDP. Those European NATO nations are taking the Russian threat seriously. Perhaps the problem is that the rest of NATO isn't doing the same. And it's that discoordination between NATO's European members that could be the alliance's undoing if Trump withdraws the US from the coalition. European NATO has the numbers and equipment to match Russia. However, if it gets bogged down in bureaucracy and debates on how to react to a Russian victory against Ukraine, it could leave itself open to being caught out. That's why NATO might burn if Ukraine falls, as Zelensky claims. So what's the solution? Ukraine's president believes he has one: the formation of a new European army. "I really believe that time has come. The armed forces of Europe must be created," Zelensky said to journalists outside the Munich Security Conference. Ukraine's president has pushed for this sort of unified European force for several years, with little progress. He also isn't clear on what the force would look like, which only adds to the challenge NATO's European members face. Royal United Service Institute Director Matthew Saville suggests that establishing a land deterrence force of 100,000 to 150,000 soldiers could effectively respond to any renewed Russian aggression, particularly if a ceasefire in Ukraine is reached. However, without US involvement, Saville believes it would be challenging to persuade nations distant from Russia's borders to commit such significant troop numbers, potentially compromising their own defenses. Alternatively, Saville proposes the formation of a tripwire force, smaller than the full deterrence force but still comprising tens of thousands of European troops stationed along critical front lines. This contingent would serve as a rapid response unit, deterring further Russian advances and ensuring that any attack would trigger a broader European military reaction. Then we have former NATO advisor Jamie Shea acknowledging the difficulties Europe faces in assembling such forces, but emphasizes their necessity to contain Russia's threat within Ukraine. He advocates for an active force of 50,000 soldiers operating in seamless rotations, requiring a total commitment of 150,000 troops to maintain a continuous deterrent presence. None of these proposals consider the possibility of European NATO starting a full-blown war against Putin over what he's done in Ukraine. It's all about deterrence, with numbers that are significantly lower than the 1.5 million troops the combined European NATO forces could bring to a fight. And there's also conflict among Europe's NATO members to consider. France, the UK and Sweden have all indicated a willingness to send troops to the front lines if necessary. However, with the recent election of Friedrich Merz as Germany's Chancellor on February 23, 2025, there is a potential shift in Germany's stance. Merz has emphasized the need for Europe to strengthen its own defense capabilities, expressing doubts about NATO's future in its current form. This could lead to a more proactive German role in European defense initiatives, but will that be enough? If European NATO isn't united against Putin, as is the case right now, then Zelensky might be right. NATO might burn, especially without US involvement, and it would lose a war with Russia not because it doesn't have the soldiers or the equipment, but because of the combined issues of a lack of cooperation and the loss of America's supporting intelligence and logistics. But what do you think NATO's chances are against Russia? Will the US withdraw from the alliance, leaving European NATO to fend for itself? And is the threat to NATO as imminent as Zelensky claims? The chances of nuclear war erupting in Europe have just skyrocketed. France has just suggested that it's willing to make a game-changing move that will see its nuclear weapons give Russian President Vladimir Putin something new to think about. And it's not just France. Germany is set to become a key part of a bold new move to create a powerful nuclear umbrella designed to protect all of Europe. The US is stunned. But what does France have up its sleeve? Why is it changing the way it uses its nuclear weapons? And what does the United States have to do with this brash new move? The initial news of France's plans comes in a February 24th report published by The Telegraph. It says that France is planning to deploy fighter jets armed with nuclear weapons to German military bases to provide Europe with a stronger nuclear shield. The move comes amidst a lot of change happening in Europe at the moment. Many on the continent are worried that US President Donald Trump is inching ever closer to withdrawing the 100,000 or so soldiers his country deploys in Europe. There are also big changes in Germany to consider. On February 23rd, Friedrich Merz won Germany's national elections. He's expected to become the country's new chancellor in the coming weeks, and he's calling on the rest of Europe to up its defense game. Putin is too much of a threat, Merz believes. The rest of Europe needs to show him that it can equal his threat. The Telegraph report leads us to several other questions, chief among them being why France is choosing to consider deploying nuclear weapons in other countries now. There are several potential answers to that question. First, this isn't an idea that's come out of the blue. The Warzone, or TWZ, points out that France has been discussing the possibility of creating a European nuclear umbrella with Germany for some time now. Merz has also been vocal in his support of a greater deterrent against Russia. France's President Emmanuel Macron met with soon-to-be German Chancellor before his February 24th meeting with Donald Trump at the White House. It's unknown exactly what took place during the discussion between Macron and Merz. There was probably some congratulating of Germany's incoming Chancellor involved. However, Macron likely travelled to speak with Merz because defence was on his mind. Merz seems to suggest as much. Before meeting with Macron, he said, "We need to have discussions with both the British and the French, the two European nuclear powers, about whether nuclear sharing or at least nuclear security from the United Kingdom and France could also apply to us." In other words, Merz is worried about Germany's future. The country doesn't have nuclear weapons of its own. That goes for every European country outside of the UK and France. The idea of sharing now is about ensuring Europe creates a stronger united front against what many see as a looming Russian threat. And that brings us to the second reason France is set to make its bold nuclear move. It wants to send a warning to Putin. Speaking to The Telegraph, an unnamed French official said, "Posting a few French nuclear jet fighters in Germany should not be difficult and would send a strong message. That message would be directed at Putin as a direct response to the many nuclear threats Russia's leader has made during his invasion of Ukraine." Since February 2022, Russia has placed its nuclear weapons on heightened alert, along with testing and deploying new nuclear capabilities, and threatening to resume nuclear testing, according to the UK's House of Commons. Putin also suspended Russia's participation in the 2010 New Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, or New START, in 2023. That treaty, which Russia signed jointly with the United States, places a limit of 1,550 nuclear warheads on Moscow. That's 30% less than the 2,200 limit set in the previous SORT treaty. It also includes restrictions on how both the US and Russia can deploy and use their missiles, bombers, and nuclear weapon launchers. Now it's out of the window, at least temporarily, as Russia battles to overcome Ukraine. The biggest European concern related to Putin's nuclear threats came in November 2024. Putin chose that month to sign a decree updating Russia's formal nuclear doctrine. That decree, uncoincidentally, came immediately after the United States approved Ukraine's use of US-made long-range missiles on Russian territory. Among the changes to Russia's doctrine was language suggesting that Russia reserves the right to use nuclear weapons as a response to conventional weapons that it believes represent a critical threat to its sovereignty and territorial integrity, according to the Arms Control Association, or ACA. The policy also says that Russia may use its nukes if it receives reliable information about incoming ballistic missiles. In short, Russia gave itself the right to use nukes if its enemies used conventional weapons on its territory. Worse yet for Europe, language in the new doctrine suggests that the right to nuclear weapon usage extends to the allies of countries that supply Russia's enemies with those conventional weapons. That puts almost the entirety of Europe in Russia's nuclear crosshairs. The European Union, or EU, alone, of which Germany and France are members, has contributed almost $139 billion in aid to Ukraine since Putin launched his invasion. There's also another $120.8 billion waiting to be allocated. Most of this money has gone toward purchasing new weapons Ukraine is using right now to attack Russia, both in Ukraine and on Russia's territory. Based on these actions, the conditions for triggering Putin's new nuclear doctrine has already been met. France's bold move is a direct response to Putin's nuclear rhetoric. Yes, Russia has access to nuclear weapons and is threatening to use them. However, Europe isn't helpless on that front. By moving some of its nukes to Germany, France places them within closer range to Russia. If Putin launches a nuclear attack, France's latest move means that Europe is primed to respond. But why is France choosing to send this message now? We hinted at the reason earlier, which also brings us to the third answer as to why France has chosen now to make its move. Europe may not be able to rely on the US nuclear threat for much longer. The US is the only country in the world that comes close to matching Russia's nuclear threat when it comes to pure numbers. According to the ACA, the US has stockpiles of 5,225 nukes. Russia is a little ahead, it has 5,580 nuclear weapons. But the two are essentially equal when it comes to pure destructive force. That matters because the United States has long guaranteed Europe's safety by stationing a small collection of its nukes on the continent. The majority of those warheads are held at military bases in Germany, which is home to around 100 missiles. Therein lies the problem for Germany. In the past, it has essentially presented a nuclear threat to Russia by virtue of America's presence in the country. That threat was reinforced by America's membership in NATO. Article 5 of NATO's charter means every member of the organization is duty-bound to come to the defense of any other member nation that's attacked by another country. If Russia launched its nuclear weapons at Germany, France, or almost any other European nation, it would likely have been met with US nuclear missile strikes. Only that isn't guaranteed anymore. According to Newsweek, Trump is already planning to withdraw 20,000 of the 100,000 soldiers the US has stationed in Europe, cutting America's forces on the continent by a fifth. Trump's first stint as US president also saw him make numerous threats that he would withdraw the US from NATO. At the time, how much fellow NATO countries paid toward their own defense was Trump's big issue. Most weren't meeting NATO's 2% of gross domestic product or GDP guideline on spending, leading Trump to claim that the US was essentially paying for Europe's defense. Trump wasn't necessarily wrong with these claims, and though he's pulled back from his talk of quitting NATO in his second term as president, you have to believe that all of these threats play on Europe's collective mind. Many on the continent don't trust America's president. They worry that he might pull even more American troops out of Europe after the initial 20,000. If that happens, what does it mean for the US-made nuclear weapons stored in Germany? Do they stay where they are? The nukes fall under the NATO umbrella, but that might not mean much if Trump starts considering withdrawing the US from the collective defense organization again. France's move is a shock to the American system as much as it is to the Russian one. It's Europe's not-so-subtle way of telling Trump that the continent doesn't need him. The United States has also been making moves over the past few weeks that trigger alarm bells in European heads. On February 3rd, Trump hinted that he might follow up the 25% tariffs he's levying on Mexico and Canada with more tariffs aimed at the EU. He told the BBC that EU tariffs could happen pretty soon, adding, "They don't take our cars, they don't take our farm products, they take almost nothing and we take everything from them. Millions of cars, tremendous amounts of food and farm products." Implementing tariffs on the EU would be Trump's way of punishing Europe for not buying enough from the United States. It's also worth mentioning that the EU has condemned Trump's decision to levy tariffs against Mexico and Canada and says that it will respond firmly if it becomes a target. More signs of fractures between Europe and the US came on February 24th. On that date, the United Nations General Assembly, or UNGA, proposed a resolution calling for a comprehensive resolution to Russia's Ukraine invasion. The United States drafted its own resolution titled "The Path to Peace" that also called for an immediate end to the hostilities, while placing no blame on either side for starting the conflict. However, it was a UNGA resolution that contained strong language condemning Russia's actions that was the key talking point. The US voted against that resolution, which many saw as a refusal by Trump to condemn Putin for his Ukraine invasion. The US joined an interesting cast of countries with that decision. China, India, Iran, and Iraq all refused to vote on the resolution, which was actually a more moderate take on the conflict than that provided by the US. America was one of only 18 nations to vote against the resolution, with others including Russia, obviously, Israel, Sudan, Hungary, and Belarus. The latter two are among the few European nations that are unwilling to condemn Putin, likely because they hold close ties with Russia. From threats of NATO withdrawal to his refusal to condemn Putin, Trump seems to be sending a clear message to Europe. He's not on the continent's side, at least not as much as Europe expects him to be. And with these fractures creating the possibility that the US might withdraw its troops and nukes from Europe, the reasons behind France's bold move become clearer. It needs to send nuclear weapons to Germany to make up for the American nukes that Europe might lose. Of course, none of this is guaranteed. The US may not withdraw its nuclear weapons at all. However, France's decision indicates that many on the continent are now taking the need to protect themselves, with or without American involvement, far more seriously. That's the fourth answer to the "why now" question. France is planning on shipping nuclear weapons to Germany because it believes it's about time Europe started taking care of itself. Macron hinted at this during his joint interview with Trump at the White House on February 24th. In addition to interrupting Trump numerous times to correct him on various issues, such as how much Europe has collectively spent in Ukraine, Macron also called on Europe to do more to protect the continent. "I'm here as well after discussions with all my colleagues to say that Europe is willing to step up to be a stronger partner, to do more in defense and security for its continent, and to be engaged on trade, economy, and investments." Remember that Macron met with incoming German Chancellor Friedrich Merz before his press conference with Trump. Perhaps stepping up is Macron's subtle way of saying that nuclear weapons are coming to Germany. There are other signs that Europe is pulling itself away from its reliance on the US. Defense spending across Europe is on the rise, hitting an average 2.2% of GDP in 2024. Several European countries have already committed to going much further than that, The Baltic states of Latvia and Estonia plan to hit 5% of GDP spending on defense in 2025, with Poland not that far behind at 4.7% of GDP. There are also suggestions that Europe is quietly working on plans to send troops into Ukraine at some point in the future. Whether those troops will be a peacekeeping force or a united European army designed to deter Putin isn't clear, but what we can take from all of this is that France's bold move to send nuclear weapons into Germany is part of a wider plan. Europe is getting stronger. It has to, given the threat that Russia poses and the wildcard status of the US right now. The question now is simple: will France's nuclear weapons be enough? It's tough to gauge. On the surface, France is nowhere near Russia when it comes to the sheer volume of nuclear weapons it has at its disposal. We touched on this earlier with the ACA stats, suggesting that Russia has 5,580 nuclear weapons. France is a long way behind. It has 290 nukes in its military stockpile, with none of those weapons being strategically deployed. That means all 290 of France's warheads are currently assigned for potential use if the need arises, rather than already being ready to go on ballistic missiles and in bomber bases. Sending nuclear weapons to Germany may change all of that. We also have to consider how France's nukes will be used and what types they have available. TWZ provides some answers here. It says the majority of the nuclear weapons that would make their way to Germany will be mounted on Air Sol Moyen Portée A, or ASMP-A, missiles. These are supersonic land attack cruise missiles that are launched from fighter jets to hit targets on the ground. Each is capable of carrying a 440-pound payload. That payload can include TN-80 and TN-81 nuclear warheads, which each have 300 kiloton yields. For context, this is one of the most common sizes of nuclear weapons, with 300 kilotons being roughly equivalent to 300,000 tons of TNT. They're extremely dangerous nukes. The American Academy of Arts and Sciences says that a single 300 kiloton nuke would create a 1-mile-wide fireball that reaches 200 million degrees at its center. Half a second after detonation, all streets and metal surfaces within 3/4 of a mile would dissolve. A massive blast wave would follow, generating winds of up to 750 miles per hour that crush buildings and send vehicles flying. 3 miles away from the blast zone, the clothes on people's backs would burst into flames, with any exposed skin suffering immediate third-degree burns. Ultimately, the wide-area fire generated by just one of these nukes would have a radius of up to 4.5 miles and would destroy an entire area of up to 65 square miles, more than enough to devastate almost any Russian city. The ASMP-A missile, used to send these nuclear warheads to their destinations, is also capable of traveling up to 310 miles. That's not an especially long range. The distance between Berlin and Moscow is about 1,000 miles, meaning France couldn't just launch its nukes from the safety of German territory. It would need the second part of the package it's planning to send, the Dassault Rafale. France's main multi-role fighter is capable of reaching a top speed of 863 miles per hour, though its approach speed drops to a little under 140 miles per hour. It has a 50,000-foot service ceiling and a combat range of up to 1,150 miles. That's enough to get the jet from Berlin to Moscow, though not quite enough to secure its safe passage back. TWZ says that France and Germany would likely use aerial tankers, which are massive aircraft used to refuel other planes while they're in the air, to ensure the Rafales can make their dangerous journeys before returning to base. Better yet, none of France's nuclear weapons fall under the NATO banner. The ASMP-A is a sovereign capability, says TWZ, which means it isn't part of the dual-key arrangement that led to the US supplying its B-61 nuclear warheads to Europe. France can do whatever it pleases with its nukes in terms of deploying and using them without worrying about NATO's guidelines. That's good news for Europe. However, there's another wild card within France's bold nuclear plan that we haven't discussed yet: the United Kingdom. Will it get involved and also supply Germany with nuclear weapons to use as a frontline deterrent against Putin? It will be a powerful ally if it did. The UK has 225 nukes in its military stockpiles, which would almost double Europe's deterrent against Russia. The country's Trident warheads can also be launched from submarines, which delivers a second option in terms of how Europe could attack Russia. However, the UK hasn't confirmed anything yet. There are signs that it might be willing to join France in contributing to Europe's new nuclear shield, though. During a visit to Kyiv on Monday, former UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson claimed that there was a moral case for Ukraine to have its own nuclear weapons. Current Prime Minister Keir Starmer also sided with European leaders ahead of Trump in calling for a resolution to the war. The UK was among the nations that signed the UN resolution that the US voted against. Plus, Britain has indicated a desire to sign a defence and security pact with the EU, which will be vital given that the UK is no longer part of that collective. France's move may be designed to get the UK involved too. An unnamed diplomat who spoke to The Telegraph says if the French move to place a nuclear deterrent in Germany, it would indeed increase pressure on the Brits to follow suit. My understanding is that on the CDU, or Counter-Disinformation Unit side, the thinking is that we need a nuclear umbrella. We want to have a say in this, we should be ready to talk about this, and we are willing to pay for it. The caveat to that claim is that the US would have to withdraw its nukes from Germany first before the UK sends any from its stockpile, says the diplomat. Perhaps that's the case for France's plan too. The Telegraph notes that it's unknown just how serious the discussions about moving French nuclear weapons to Germany are. Talks may be in their early stages. It may also be months or even years before we see any movement. So much seems to depend on what the US does with its nukes. One thing is for certain. Putin can't rely on the US pulling its nukes to minimize the threat Europe poses to his imperialistic ambitions anymore. France is willing to replace those nuclear weapons with warheads of its own, showing Putin and Trump that Europe is taking what happens on its continent very seriously. But what do you think about France's bold move? Is it sending a message to the US with its nuclear plans? How will Putin respond? Everything is on the table. Those were the words of Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau on February 24th as he revealed that the Great White North is planning to step up a gear in the Ukraine war. This is big. Canada is preparing to screw Russia, and best of all, it's doing it with Russia's own money. The US is shocked at Canada's power play. But what exactly is Canada preparing to do? And what impact will the country's decision for Ukraine have on the war? It all starts with a pledge. On February 24th, dozens of world leaders came together for a peace and security summit held in Kyiv. Trudeau was among the dozens, and he made a massive announcement to mark the third anniversary of Putin starting his special military operation. $5 billion in aid. This is not a conflict Ukraine wanted, provoked, or asked for in any way, said Trudeau at the summit table. These remarks appear to be a direct response to US President Donald Trump. "You should have never started it," Trump roared in a Truth Social post earlier in February, appearing to echo Russia's claims that Ukraine started the three-year war with Russia. Russian President Vladimir Putin himself made the claim in February 2024 during an interview with Tucker Carlson. "It was they who started the war in 2014, Putin told Carlson. "Our goal is to stop this war, and we did not start this war in 2022. Those were odd claims to make given that Russia invaded Ukraine, with Putin justifying his actions by claiming that he wanted to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. Canada has just outright rejected that idea. And in doing so, it also rejected Trump's recent claims that Zelensky started the Ukraine war. "This is a war that started for one reason and one reason only: Russia's desire to erase Ukrainian history and expand their empire," said Trudeau at the Kyiv summit. It's for that reason that Canada is prepared to send $5 billion in aid to Ukraine. But here's the best part. None of that money is actually coming from Canada directly. Instead, Canada will use the funds seized from Russian assets that have been frozen in the Great White North since Putin started his war. Ukraine is finally going to be able to fight against Russia using Russia's own money, and it gets worse for Putin. $5 billion isn't the limit of what Canada can provide to Ukraine via Russia's frozen assets. It's just the first installment of revenues generated from those assets. For several years, Canada has been promising to forfeit all holdings associated with Russia's oligarchs and its government to Ukraine. It's also pushed for Europeans to do the same with the Russian assets they have frozen in their accounts. At the very least, those countries should be delivering the interest generated by those assets to Ukraine, Canada claimed. In short, there's more coming. Canada's $5 billion, though a massive sum in its own right, is just a drop in the bucket of the $300 billion worth of sovereign Russian assets currently frozen in Western banks. That $300 billion accounted for around half of Russia's total reserves of $612 billion held in foreign currency and gold as of December 2023. Canada controls a not insignificant amount of those assets. Reuters says Russia currently holds $19 billion in Canadian dollars. That means that Canada still has over $14 billion in frozen Russian assets that it could distribute to Ukraine. This also assumes that the $5 billion being donated now comes directly from the frozen assets. It's possible that some of the money was generated via interest, meaning that Canada may have even more than the $14 billion left to give. We also mentioned that Canada is pushing Europe to follow its lead and start using its frozen Russian assets to help Ukraine. It isn't alone in that call. One day before Trudeau's announcement, Estonia launched its own renewed push to convince its fellow European Union or EU members to do the same. The Baltic country sent a discussion paper to its EU partners on February 23rd and had plans to raise it in a meeting held on the same day that Trudeau made his announcement. The decision to use the windfall profits was a step in the right direction, claimed Estonian Foreign Minister Margus Tsahkna, when referring to Europe using the interest generated by the frozen Russian assets it holds to help Ukraine. I see that the time is ripe now to take the next step. What would the next step look like? Handing over all of the Russian assets Europe currently holds to Ukraine. The vast majority of Russia's frozen assets are held in European and British banks. Russia has invested $207 billion of those frozen $300 billion in the euro. If EU countries release that money, it would almost double the $138.58 billion it has already allocated to Ukraine since Putin started his war. The UK could get in on the act too. Russia holds around $37 billion in British pound assets, which might also be released to bring the total from Europe up to $244 billion. That would be a massive hit in Putin's imperialistic ambitions. Trudeau's and Estonia's calls to use those assets more effectively are currently being ignored. That won't matter to Ukraine right now. It's about to receive a $5 billion influx that it can dedicate it to its growing domestic arms industry. By 2024, about 500 arms producers were operating in Ukraine, employing 300,000 people in total. Canada's donation of frozen Russian assets will have a huge impact on research and development for those arms producers, which ultimately means the creation of more weapons Ukraine can use to defend itself against Russia. That will come as a major shock to Putin. 3 unnamed sources told Reuters that Putin had his own plans for the frozen $300 billion. He was willing to concede the money, the sources said, but he would only do so if the cash was used for the reconstruction of Ukraine after his war ended. How magnanimous of Russia's leader, right? Not so much. The sources also said that Putin would insist on the money only being used to rebuild the parts of Ukraine that Russia holds. In other words, Putin is assuming that any peace talks he holds with Ukraine will result in Russia gaining Mariupol and large portions of the Donetsk region, with what he sees as his money only being dedicated to the rebuilding efforts in those regions. Ukraine wouldn't get a dollar. It's unknown if Putin's ideas for the frozen funds were discussed when he held his meeting with Donald Trump in Saudi Arabia in mid-February, but if they were, Canada's decision would be a major shock to the US system. How is Trump supposed to be able to guarantee that Putin can use his frozen assets to rebuild if those assets are being sent to Ukraine to fund its war effort? While the US contends with that issue, Trudeau wasn't done with his announcements. While the delivery of $5 billion in frozen Russian assets to Ukraine was the Canadian headline at the Kyiv Peace Summit, Trudeau had plenty more up his sleeve. Ukraine isn't just receiving Russian money. It's also getting vehicles and a grant from Canada. We don't yet know much about the grant, other than it will be used to help Ukraine improve its energy security amidst Putin's constant attacks on the Ukrainian power grid. Those attacks have been a hallmark of Putin's approach to his invasion throughout 2024. He launched a massive strike involving 16 missiles and 13 drones on Lviv and Zaporizhzhia in June 2024, which managed to damage equipment in the former and wounded 2 energy workers in the latter. That strike was the 8th attack against Ukrainian infrastructure launched in 3 months, according to Ukraine. The attacks kept ramping up. The following months saw more Russian missiles and drones battering Ukraine's power grid, culminating in Russia's 12th assault on the Ukrainian grid in a year on December 13, 2024. That attack took place when temperatures in Ukraine had reached a freezing 21.2 degrees Fahrenheit and involved 93 missiles and almost 200 drones. Ukraine's air defenses managed to shoot 81 of the missiles down, with 11 being taken out by Ukraine's F-16s, but that still meant a dozen got through, along with some of Russia's drones. The mention of Ukraine's freezing temperatures hints at why Putin is carrying out these attacks. He believes that taking out Ukraine's electricity-generating capacity will make life hell for the country's citizens, and he's right. Russia's energy grid assaults have already destroyed about half of Ukraine's generating capacity, along with some of its distribution systems. Long blackouts and lack of access to heating are the results. Putin wants to cripple morale in Ukraine with these terroristic attacks that impact the country's citizens. Canada's grant should help Ukraine as it rebuilds and develops more defenses to keep its power grid safe. As for the donated vehicles, Trudeau used the Kyiv summit to pledge 25 of Canada's LAV-3s to Ukraine. These light armored vehicles look like mini tanks, and they'll give Ukraine plenty of mobility and firepower on the battlefield. They can reach top speeds of 62 miles per hour, over a range of 280 miles before requiring refueling. And the LAV-3 is also capable of crossing 6.5-foot trenches, which will be important to Ukraine given Putin's reliance on trench warfare tactics. Each vehicle is armed with an M242 Bushmaster 25mm cannon, along with a secondary 7.62mm coaxial machine gun that fires standard NATO rounds. Ukraine also has the option of adding 76mm smoke grenade dischargers that are useful for evasive maneuvers, along with a Mag-58 turret-top machine gun to further boost the LAV-3's firepower. Thermal sights are built into the periscopes and viewing ports available to the vehicle's driver, commander, and gunner, making the LAV-3 just as impactful at night as it is during the day. Add all of this to an integrated GPS and digital compass system, VHS and Harris high-frequency radios, and an automatic warning system designed to counter the most common battlefield laser threats, and you get a very powerful vehicle. On top of that, Canada is also going to provide a pair of combat support vehicles to Ukraine. It'll also facilitate training for those vehicles, along with the LAV-3s, in Germany so Ukraine's troops can make the most of them. We also mentioned how Ukraine used its F-16s to shoot down Russian missiles earlier. Canada is going to help with that as well. Trudeau promised Canada would also donate a landing system for Ukraine's F-16 fighters, along with 4 flight simulators designed around the jets. Those simulators will prove vital for helping Ukraine train more of its pilots to fly the 61 F-16s that have been promised to it by several of its European partners. Ammunition, first aid kits, and drone camera components are also among the impressive military aid package Canada has promised to Ukraine, in addition to the $5 billion in frozen Russian assets. Trudeau also promised that Canada would continue training Ukraine's troops so they could defend the Western-led world order against Russia's invasion. All of these are signals that Canada is going to do everything it can to support Ukraine. Think about what this means from Trump's perspective. America's president has already developed a contentious relationship with Canada. Even before he became president, Trump was claiming that Canada should become the 51st US state. He's also disrespected Trudeau constantly, referring to him as governor rather than prime minister at every opportunity. Those comments have been passed off as jokes and non-starters in most quarters, but they offer insight into how Trump views one of America's closest allies. Trump has also threatened Canada with tariffs, though he agreed to pause those tariffs in early February as a response to Canada increasing its border security. The rhetoric has started again. The month-long pause is coming to an end, with Trump claiming that the tariffs are going forward on time. On February 24th. If implemented, the US will rock Canada with a 25% tariff on most of the goods it exports to the US. Trump claimed that Canada has taken advantage of the US for too long during a White House news conference that included France's President Emmanuel Macron. This is an abuse that took place for many, many years. The tariffs will go forward, yes, and we're going to make up a lot of territory, said Trump. Of course, we also can't forget that Trump is trying to position himself as the arbiter of peace in the Ukraine war. He's already held the previously mentioned discussions with Putin in Saudi Arabia, cutting Ukraine out of the equation altogether. He's blaming Ukraine for supposedly starting the war, and he's even gone so far as to call Zelensky a dictator. He also refused to label Putin the same way during the White House press conference with Macron, suggesting that he favors Russia's side of the story ahead of Ukraine's side. Canada unfreezing $5 billion in Russian assets to send to Ukraine, along with its latest military aid package, shows us that Trudeau is biting back. While Trump seems to increasingly support Putin, Canada is heading in the opposite direction. It's betting on Ukraine. And it's doing everything it can to screw Russia. If it was just the money and light armored vehicles that Trudeau discussed on February 24th, that would be enough to worry Putin. It would show him that Ukraine is retaining an extremely important ally during a time when that ally is under pressure from the United States. But there's more, much more. Trudeau is actively questioning how the United States is approaching peace negotiations for the Ukraine war. We cannot return to an era where might makes right, Canada's Prime Minister said at the Kyiv summit. We must do everything in our power to enable Ukraine to secure a just and lasting peace, a peace that cannot be achieved without Ukrainians at the table. By now it's obvious that Trudeau is referring to the Saudi Arabia meeting between Putin and Trump. Again, Canada is outright opposing America's strategy for dealing with Russia. It's also committed to helping Ukraine secure a form of peace that's favorable to the country. Once a just peace is secured, Canada stands at the ready to work with our partners around the world to provide Ukraine the security it needs for the peace to last, allowing it to recover, rebuild, and prosper, added Trudeau. In other words, Canada doesn't believe a ceasefire is enough. It's also not going to allow Russia and the US to arrange a version of peace that favors Putin. Canada will continue to arm Ukraine. The moment to stop this war of aggression, the moment to defend democracy, the moment to stand for our shared values is now, Trudeau declared. Again, another shock to the US system. As Trump decries Zelensky as a dictator, Canada's Prime Minister lauds him as a defender of democracy. This isn't how Putin's ideas of might making right was supposed to go. He believed that getting the US on his side even a little bit would help him secure a version of peace that favors Russia. Canada has just positioned itself in the direct opposition to that type of peace, which is a massive boon for Ukraine. Perhaps Canada's approach is already having an impact on Putin. Also on February 24th, news emerged that Putin is no longer opposed to allowing European involvement in the peace negotiations he's holding with Trump. Putin didn't specify whether Ukraine could still be involved. Still, it's a step forward. Their participation in the negotiating process is needed, Putin said when referring to the continent his special military operation threatens. "We never rejected that. We held constant discussions with them," Putin added. He also defended the Saudi Arabia meeting, claiming that any peace would have to start with Russia and the US making the first step. Ukraine was never mentioned. But the suggestion seems to be that more parties willing to fight on Ukraine's side will soon enter peace discussions. There's one more little aspect of Trudeau's appearance at the Kyiv summit that we've yet to discuss. Do you remember the quote we used at the start of the video? "Everything is on the table," said Trudeau. That comment didn't come in reference to Canada unfreezing $5 billion of Russian assets or its delivery of a new round of military aid to Ukraine. Instead, it came after Trudeau was asked a simple question by reporters: is Canada willing to put boots on the ground in Ukraine? That question didn't differentiate between whether those boots would be part of a peacekeeping force or a Canadian military fighting alongside Ukraine, but to Trudeau, that distinction doesn't seem to matter. "We're going to have to continue to do more and more in an uncertain world, and Canada will be there," Trudeau said in response. "As to how we will be there, we will work with our neighbors on it, but everything is on the table because we need to make sure that might no longer makes right in this world." What you don't hear anywhere in that quote is Trudeau saying, "No, Canada won't send troops into Ukraine." Has Trudeau just pledged Canada's army to Ukraine if it's needed? Not quite. But as Trudeau says, everything is on the table. If Canada does get directly involved in the Ukraine conflict, whether as a fighting or peacekeeping force, it delivers the world's 28th strongest military, according to aggregator Global Firepower. Canada has 68,000 active military personnel, along with 27,000 in reserve. These aren't massive numbers considering the meat grinder that Putin has created in Ukraine. However, Ukraine will happily take what it can get, especially as many of Canada's soldiers are well trained and have taken part in NATO-led military operations in the past. Canada also has a stock of 351 aircraft, including 66 fighter jets and a tanker fleet of 6 planes that Ukraine could use to refuel its aircraft while they're still in the air. Canada's stock of military vehicles is also impressive, as it could bring over 21,700 to the fight. Plus, it has a navy totaling 73 assets with a tonnage of 119,637. That navy includes 4 submarines and 12 frigates, all of which Ukraine could put to good use against Russia via the Baltic Sea if Canada put fighting boots on the ground. Of course, the possibility of Canadian boots on the ground doesn't equate to a certainty. Trudeau hasn't confirmed whether his country's soldiers will enter Ukraine. But he's not shying away from the chance that it could happen, and his comments come as Trump claims that Putin is apparently willing to allow a European peace force into Ukraine. He will accept that. "I've asked him that question," Trump claimed during his White House press conference with Emmanuel Macron. "Look, if we do this deal, he's not looking for more war. I've specifically asked him that question. He has no problem with it." If Trump is accurate, Putin's acceptance of European troops in Ukraine will be a massive U-turn in Russian policy. Previously, even a peacekeeping force has been described as an escalation by Putin. Now it's supposedly an idea that Russia is willing to get behind, at least according to Trump. Maybe the future will see that European peace force being supplemented by Canadian troops. We'll have to wait and see. For now, Canada is screwing Russia by making it clear just how far it's willing to go to support Ukraine. Using $5 billion in frozen Russian assets to provide more aid to Ukraine stings Putin. So does the announcement that Canada is providing yet another military aid package outside of its $5 billion, along with a grant to support Ukraine's power grid. But perhaps most worrying of all for Putin is that his hope that America's pressure on Canada would benefit him isn't being realized. Canada still stands defiant against Russia. That will only benefit Ukraine as Putin's invasion moves into its 4th calendar year. But what do you think about Canada's decision to unfreeze Russian assets and solidify its support of Ukraine? How will it affect the Ukraine war? How will Trump react? And might we see Canadian boots on Ukrainian soil sooner rather than later?
A historic shift is in progress as the European Union is preparing to unleash an unprecedented military revival. Reports indicate that a massive new defense package is being prepared, one that's aimed at both bolstering Ukraine and fortifying Europe against the expansionist ambitions of Russian President Vladimir Putin. With tensions rising and questions looming over U.S. support, this initiative could completely reshape the balance of power and lead to Europe being capable of defending itself against Russia with or without the United States. This new defense package is a game changer. Here's what you need to know. On February 17th, reports surfaced that French President Emmanuel Macron was inviting key European leaders to urgent talks in Paris. Those emergency discussions come in response to a stark warning from the United States. There's a limit on how much America is prepared to do for Europe. With growing concerns over security and shifting geopolitical alliances, the stakes have never been higher. U.S. President Donald Trump's return has signaled a shift in European defense. For over 80 years, Europe has relied heavily on U.S. military support. A long-standing point of contention for Trump, who argues that America is footing too much of the bill. Now with Washington signaling a tougher stance, European leaders are facing a stark reality. It's time to take defense into their own hands. During the Munich Security Conference, the discussion centered on what Europe could do to make itself less reliant on American support. The overall consensus was that the United States was no longer going to foot the bill for NATO security, claimed Republican Congressman Michael McCall in the wake of the conference. Our European allies recognize that it's time for them to step up to the plate in their own backyard. Stepping up to the plate means reviving Europe's collective militaries. It also means ramping up support for Ukraine as it continues to resist Putin's invasion. So, how does Europe plan to do that? By moving forward with what could become the largest defense package in the continent's history. An unprecedented effort that would strengthen its military capabilities and secure its future. Reports have indicated that the European officials who will meet in Paris are secretly working on creating a massive €700 billion aid package, or around $730 billion, all of which Europe intends to dedicate to collective defense. Germany's Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock offered the first hints about the incoming package. Speaking to reporters during the Munich Security Conference, she said the package has never been seen in this dimension before. It's a staggering sum. That $700+ billion number was first reported by the German newspaper Berliner Zeitung, which cited German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock as suggesting the number. Baerbock compared the plan to past financial rescue efforts, stating, "Similar to the Eurozone and the Corona crisis, there is now a financial package for security in Europe that will come in the near future." Baerbock is referring to the €672.5 billion recovery fund established after the COVID-19 pandemic, an initiative designed to stabilize Europe's economy over 6 years. But this time the focus isn't on economic recovery, it's military recovery. Lithuanian Defense Minister Dovilė Šakalienė was among the first to laud the package, stating that Europe has reached the realization that it's not the US which will defend Europe, but Europe defending ourselves with help from the US. Šakalienė added, "We need to spend on defense fast, and a lot. Hundreds of billions need to be spent immediately. We will all have to move fast, Germany included." But there's a problem. As is so often the case in the European Union, bureaucracy is slowing progress. With Germany's regional elections approaching on February 23rd, officials are hesitant to make any major defense commitments that could spark political controversy. Instead, leaders are expected to hold off on formal announcements until after the dust has settled and the votes are counted. Still, Baerbock underscores the urgency, pointing out that peace in Europe can only be achieved if all of the anti-Russia countries on the continent pull together. She added, "As Europeans and as Germans, we stand firmly with Ukraine, militarily, humanitarily, and financially. Since Russia's full-scale invasion, we Europeans have provided over $140.16 billion in aid to Ukraine, with Germany contributing nearly $46 billion. Those are impressive figures, and that's exactly why leaders are now pushing forward with a historic defense plan, one that could reshape the future of European security. After all, Europe has already dedicated well over $100 billion to supporting Ukraine, as Baerbock pointed out. So why is it now looking to spend more than 5 times that amount on collective defense after 3 years of the Ukraine war? There are several answers to that question, with the first involving the man who launched the special military operation in February 2022, Vladimir Putin. Many on the continent are worried that victory in Ukraine won't signal the end of Putin's expansionist goals. If anything, that would just be the start. If Putin wins in Ukraine, he might set his sights on the rest of Europe, especially if he believes NATO has weakened. That's according to the Danish Defense Intelligence Service, or DDIS, which says Russia would be ready to wage a large-scale war against Europe within 5 years. Russia's likely to be more willing to use military force in a regional war against one or more European NATO countries if it perceives NATO as militarily weakened or politically divided, says the DDIS. This is particularly true if Russia assesses that the US cannot or will not support the European NATO countries in a war with Russia. The American support issue is a major hurdle, and we'll be returning to that issue soon. The more pressing problem is that if Putin is ready to wage war in Europe, the EU needs to be ready, and frankly, it isn't. That's according to Ukraine's Prime Minister Denis Shmyhal writing for Politico on February 14th. He said that Russia has already unleashed a war against the EU. Granted, that war doesn't involve tanks rolling through the streets or air sirens blaring daily. It's instead a hybrid war in which Putin's regime has been looking for cracks in the European house, and when he finds them, he pours boiling water in them or tries to pry them open with a crowbar, says Schmeichel. Destroying underseas internet cables, sending drones over European air bases, creating migration pressure on the Polish and Lithuanian borders, these are all signs that Putin is already at war with Europe in a non-conventional sense. They are also signs that Putin is setting the stage for future aggression, according to Schmeichel. Putin is putting pressure on Europe even as his forces fight in Ukraine, and Europe may not be ready to fend him off if he makes his war continent-wide. On the surface, that doesn't seem like it should be the case. Excluding the United States, European NATO would still be able to bring 1.5 million troops to a fight against Russia. That stacks up well against the 1.32 million active personnel in Putin's military. Europe also has access to more technologically advanced instruments of war. Russia has been forced to rely on Soviet-era tanks and artillery to sustain its bombardments in Ukraine. Advanced Western weapons, in addition to Ukraine's ever-growing drone stockpiles, have helped to push Putin back. Those advanced weapons would come to the fore in a war between Europe and Russia. NATO also excels in conducting combined arms operations that see air forces, navies, and ground troops cooperating to achieve a shared goal. That's something Russia has shown itself incapable of doing, as the destruction of over a third of the Black Sea Fleet and Putin's reliance on human wave assaults demonstrates. However, matching or exceeding Russia's manpower and equipment capabilities alone won't be enough to defeat Putin. European NATO heavily relies on the US for some of its key capabilities. Operational intelligence is typically provided by America. The US also has the largest fleet of aerial tankers in the world, which enable air-to-air refueling. Plus, it plays a key part in Europe's missile defense strategy. And without the US to match Russia's nuclear weapon stockpiles, Europe brings only 515 nukes to the table to compete with Russia's 5,580. Europe still has a ways to go to prepare itself for a war with Russia. A substantial portion of the proposed $700 billion defense package is expected to go towards strengthening key military capabilities that would be critical if the United States were no longer in the fight. But this package is actually about more than just bolstering Europe's defenses. It's also a direct response to a growing reality. Europe can no longer count on the US as its ultimate safeguard. At the Munich Security Conference, leaders grappled with a pressing question: how will Europe secure itself without guaranteed American support? And while some may believe Washington would never turn its back on European defense, the facts tell a different story. The reality, US support is no longer a certainty. Two key factors are driving that shift: the financial burden on Washington and what appears to be a dramatic shift in US policy toward Russia. For years, President Donald Trump has made claims that NATO's European members aren't paying their fair share for defense. His criticisms date back to 2017, when only 5 of NATO's 28 members met the alliance's 2% GDP defense spending target. A stark contrast to the United States, which covered 22% of NATO's total costs, according to the New York Times. Since then, much has changed. NATO is larger, with its membership growing to 32 countries since 2017. More of those countries are hitting or exceeding the 2% target too. 23 of the 32 hit the 2% target in 2024, but that may not be enough for Trump. Michael McCaul hinted at that with his comments about how it was time for Europe to step up to the plate. And if there was any doubt that money was still on Trump's mind, those doubts were dispelled in February when Trump made some interesting claims about military aid to Ukraine. Well, we gave them, I believe, $350 billion. But let's say it's something less than that, but it's a lot. And we have to equalize with Europe because Europe has given a very much smaller percentage than that, Trump claimed. I think Europe has given $100 billion and we've given, let's say, $300 billion plus. And it's more important for them than it is for us. We have an ocean in between and they don't. Those numbers aren't strictly accurate, at least according to the Kiel Institute for the World Economy's Ukraine Support Tracker. It says that the US has allocated about $119 billion in aid to Ukraine. Collectively, Europe has allocated even more than that, $137.94 billion, with another $120 billion to be allocated in the future. Assuming that the tracker is correct, Europe has more than doubled America's military aid outlay for the Ukraine war when combining allocated and yet to be allocated funds. Yet for Trump, perception always outweighs reality. He insists the US is paying more than its fair share, and he has repeatedly floated the idea of the US leaving NATO over defense spending concerns. Even as more European nations meet the 2% obligation, America's president seems to be moving the goalposts. He now believes that NATO members should be spending 5% of their GDP on defense, claiming that they can all afford it. It's possible Trump is using that figure to give him an excuse to pull the US out of NATO if its European members don't hit his new 5% target. That's despite the fact that the US doesn't spend that much. It's dedicated 3.38% of its GDP to defense in 2024. Europe is worried about Trump and all his money-related rhetoric. Even if the figures Trump delivers aren't accurate, the fact that he believes them to be so is enough. To Europe, it looks like Trump is looking for a way to escape America's NATO obligations. If he's successful, that would mean no US support if Europe went to war with Russia. The $700 billion defense package is likely a direct response to that possibility. Europe's concerns about the US support aren't solely money-related, though. Also concerning to Europe is what appears to be a complete turnaround in America's approach to the Ukraine war. The turnaround seemed to start earlier in February when Trump held initial talks with Putin in Saudi Arabia about how to bring an end to his special military operation. There was a key issue with those talks: Ukraine wasn't invited. In the wake of his meeting with Putin, Trump has become extremely critical of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. He claimed to be very disappointed to hear that Ukraine was upset about not having a seat at the table for his talks with Putin. "Today I heard, oh, well, we weren't invited." "Well, you've been there for 3 years," Trump exclaimed. "You should have never started it. You could have made a deal," Trump added. These comments appear to show Trump repositioning Ukraine as the aggressor in its conflict with Russia. America's president didn't stop there. In a post on Truth Social, Trump decried Zelensky as a modestly successful comedian who managed to talk the United States into spending $350 billion on a war Ukraine could never win without the US. The only thing Zelensky was good at was playing Biden like a fiddle, Trump claimed before adding a jibe that sent shockwaves through Europe. A dictator without elections. Zelensky better move fast or he is not going to have a country left. To Trump, it appears that Putin is no longer the war-waging dictator of the Ukraine war. That title goes to Zelensky. He went on to claim that Zelensky had done a terrible job shattering his country and causing millions of unnecessary deaths. There are now also rumors circulating that Trump is considering pulling American troops out of the Baltic states. That's according to America's ambassador to NATO, Julie Smith, who believes Trump may agree to Putin's demands to withdraw 20,000 US soldiers sent to Europe by Joe Biden in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Worse yet, that withdrawal could have knock-on effects. Britain, France, and Germany all have battle groups on Europe's eastern flank that they may be forced to withdraw if the American troops disappear. There's also a possibility that Trump will pull the 30,000-plus troops stationed in Germany. The lights are blinking red, warned Smith, and Europe is paying attention. Combine Putin's ambitions for Europe, the potential for America's withdrawal of funds and troops, and Trump seemingly supporting Putin ahead of Zelensky in recent days, and you get a powder keg waiting to explode. Europe doesn't believe that it can rely on the US anymore. With all of his rhetoric, Trump is reinforcing that belief. So, the $700 billion defense package isn't just an investment, it's a strategic necessity. With US support for European security increasingly uncertain, Europe is taking matters into its own hands, preparing for a future where it may have to stand against Russia without Washington's backing. While no official announcement has been made, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte has outlined key priorities for how the $700 billion be spent. He says that military training will be a priority, likely involving continuing efforts in Ukraine along with training for European troops to prepare them for the possibility of war against Putin's forces. In November 2024, the EU extended its commitment to its military training mission in Ukraine by 2 years. It's likely that more money will be poured into that mission, with the EU also now seeing it as a chance to train troops on how to cooperate with Ukraine's forces should they ever need to fight together against Russia directly. Some of the $700 billion may go toward further extending this training mission and perhaps providing more European troops in Ukraine. We may also see an expansion of the EU's Common Security and Defense Policy, or CSDP. Under the CSDP, the EU deploys around 3,500 military personnel and 1,300 civilians around the world. Those people are currently working across 21 missions and operations, including 8 military operations, 12 civilian-led initiatives, and 1 mission involving both civilians and military personnel. It's likely the CSDP will expand its scope with help from the $700 billion cash injection. That could mean more military operations in the future, allowing the EU to project power without America's help, along with more support for CSDP's ongoing operations. Another possibility now gaining traction is the formation of a European army. It's telling that Macron has invited some of Europe's major leaders to a secret conference in the wake of a $700 billion defense announcement. Back in May 2024, Macron was the first EU leader to claim he would consider sending troops to Ukraine if Russia broke through in the country. He's since walked those comments back, ruling out the possibility as recently as February 19th. Macron's comments also met with condemnation from many in Europe that felt he was needlessly escalating the conflict with Putin. However, even with his claims that France isn't considering sending French combat troops to Ukraine, it's clear that building a defense against Russia is on Macron's mind. What the defense might look like is the key question. Matthew Seville, who is the director of military sciences at the Royal United Services Institute think tank, believes that Europe may create a large land deterrence force if it went down the European army route. That force would need to include somewhere between 100,000 and 150,000 troops to be strong enough to respond to Putin's aggression. That's around the range of troops Zelensky believes he needs to sustain Ukraine's defense. It's also possible that Europe could create a smaller tripwire force of several tens of thousands of soldiers operating in Ukraine after a ceasefire is announced in Putin's war. Any attempt by Putin to re-invade after the war would trip the wire, pushing Europe into a direct conflict with Russia. While these are all still just suggestions and Europe hasn't committed to building any sort of united European army, it's possible that some of the $700 billion is being earmarked for laying the foundations of a future where that army is needed. More likely and more directly helpful to Ukraine out of all of these options is that most of the money will be dedicated to accelerating European aid efforts and arms deliveries to Kyiv. The US may be helpful in that arena. On February 13th, America committed to speeding up weapons shipments to Europe by eliminating much of the red tape that slows these shipments down. This commitment came before Trump's comments indicating that he's changed his opinion on Zelensky and the Ukraine war. However, if the United States maintains that commitment, we'll likely see where much of the $700 billion will go. Europe will buy from the US, it'll then send those purchased weapons to Ukraine to aid in its defense. That could also be enough to assuage Trump's money worries. After all, a large portion of $700 billion being pumped into the American economy would be great news for Trump. He'd see that Europe is committed to paying its way, which might lead him to conclude that supporting the continent in the fight against Putin isn't such a bad idea. All of this remains to be seen. For now, we know that Europe has transformed itself with its $700 billion plus pledge in its defense. It's gearing up for a war along with increasing its support of Ukraine at a time when the continent's alliance with the US is on shaky ground. We want to know what you think, though. Will this massive cash injection be enough to stop Putin?
Artillery has always been the backbone of modern warfare, but now Ukraine is about to flip the script. For years, Russia relied on sheer numbers, blasting away with endless artillery shells and outdated tactics. It outproduced NATO, pounding Ukraine's forces with brute force, hoping to overwhelm them. But brute force can't beat brilliance. Thanks to cutting-edge tech from Germany and Norway, Ukraine is fielding a game-changing weapon: ramjet artillery. These supersonic rounds don't just go farther, they go faster, strike harder, and leave Russia's old-school tactics in the dust. So what makes ramjet artillery so deadly? And could this be the weapon that breaks Russia's grip on the battlefield? Let's dive in. At its core, a ramjet artillery round has more in common with a jet engine than a traditional explosive artillery round. Like a jet engine, a ramjet round has an intake tube that has an opening at the front to take in the air as the round flies. The air then enters the mixing chamber, where it's ignited alongside small amounts of rocket fuel that the engine carries with it. The resulting combustion is directed to the exhaust chamber, which provides thrust. So unlike traditional artillery, which typically tops out with a range of 40 to 50 miles, modern ramjet designs could realistically have 2 to 5 times the reach of current missiles while retaining the same size, putting them on par with traditional short-range ballistic missiles like ATACMS. This means that an artillery battery could theoretically apply the same pressure at a fraction of the cost in terms of logistics and development. The ramjet is a relatively old concept that's seen a revival in recent years. Technology has advanced enough that it's possible to fit the necessary pieces inside the relatively small shell that is a 155mm artillery round. Germany and Norway in particular have 2 of the most promising prototypes currently in development, and they have started sending these prototypes for field testing in Ukraine. A traditional rocket like the ones being used to shuttle aircraft into space burns internal fuel storage to create thrust and reach operating speeds. This means that the rocket needs to carry significant amounts of fuel to reach meaningful speeds. A ramjet, on the other hand, needs relatively little actual fuel to maintain high speeds. Air has a natural quality called ram compression, which is when the air pressure significantly increases with velocity. This allows a jet engine to take in significant amounts of compressed air to further boost its speeds. Additionally, jet engines suffer from a distinct disadvantage compared to traditionally propelled missiles and rockets. They don't work at low speeds. Since the efficiency of a jet engine relies on air being compressed, a jet engine would need to burn through conventional fuel instead of air to reach the speeds necessary for ram compression to take effect. For the ramjet, these speeds can hit Mach 2.5 to 3, which is around 3 times the speed of sound. That means that traditional jet engines, like the one you see on aircraft, suffer significantly because they need to accelerate the entire structure to speeds where they actually become efficient. It's a bit of a catch-22 since jet engines work best at high speeds, but they first need to reach those speeds somehow. But that's why the concept works for artillery. Ramjet artillery pretty much avoids the acceleration problem entirely. Since the artillery battery, i.e. a cannon, is responsible for the initial delivery, a ramjet round is shot out at the speed necessary for the engine to start working near its full operating capacity. This, in theory, means that an artillery round can then use its internal fuel supplies alongside the air intake to maintain high speeds until it reaches its target. The technology that made ramjet engines possible has already been in use in conventional jet engines for decades. But it's only recently that the engines of this type could be made relatively small. This has meant that they still suffered from the inherent weakness of not being able to be accelerated toward their efficient operational parameters, i.e. Mach 3 speeds at which ram compression starts taking hold. That's why the experimental ramjet artillery shows so much promise. Downsizing the ramjet engine to be able to fit inside a traditional 155mm round casing could, in theory, transform how artillery works. And with downsizing, there's the inherent advantage of the increased range. Traditionally, if you wanted to increase the range of a projectile, there would only be a few possible avenues for you to take. For instance, you could increase the muzzle velocity or speed at which the projectile leaves the detonation chamber. For traditional artillery, there was only so much speed you could impart on the round, since the round itself didn't have any self-propelling capabilities. Over time, air drag and gravity would do their work, slowly decelerating the round until it reached the ground. To increase the muzzle velocity in traditional artillery, you need to use a more powerful propellant or a longer barrel. However, there's only so much propellant you can fit inside a detonation chamber before you start getting diminishing returns. More powerful propellants would create pressure that could damage the barrel of the artillery, severely reducing its expected lifespan. The second way is to increase the length and strength of the barrel. Increasing the length allows for the propellant to impart more of its impulse on the projectile due to the longer amount of time they stay in contact with each other. The third way to increase the range of the projectile is to modify the projectile itself. This is done by adjusting the aerodynamics and including sabots, a piece that fits around a projectile to keep it aligned in the center of the barrel, to create a more streamlined profile that would reduce the amount of drag the projectile is subjected to during the flight. Alternatively, projectiles with lower mass have greater maximum speeds. However, this led to a series of trade-offs, as artillery rounds depended on its explosive warhead to inflict damage. Additionally, modern artillery rounds need tips made of heavy metals that can penetrate the armored hulls of vehicles and bunkers. Thus, increasing the projectile speed and subsequently distance would end up lowering the potential explosive yield of the artillery round, reducing its overall effectiveness. The ramjet artillery round solves this problem inherently. By using a jet engine, the ammunition suddenly has a self-propelling component. The US had already experimented with self-propelled artillery rounds even before the ramjet engines were developed. For instance, base bleed artillery would have a simple engine mounted at the back of the round that would burn internal propellant. However, the result of the improvement wasn't particularly worth the investment. The added self-propelling capacity didn't meaningfully increase the actual speed of the round, only reduced the inevitable deceleration caused by air drag. Furthermore, the addition of the propellant cannibalized the round's explosive yield, as it would have done with a lighter warhead. That's why a ramjet having a smarter jet engine is such a big deal. The engine's efficiency means that it needs significantly less fuel to achieve or maintain higher speeds. By abusing the inherent quality of the air to compress at high speeds, the jet engine essentially feeds into its own speed. Additionally, as the engine burns off its fuel, it becomes lighter, which allows it to counter some of the velocity loss accrued by air and gravity drag as it flies. The result is a theoretical range of ramjet artillery rounds of 100 miles in more recent experiments. Compare that to the traditional range of artillery rounds, such as the ones currently used in the war in Ukraine, which is typically between 20 and 40 miles at best. This means ramjet artillery has ranges that approach that of conventional missiles, including ATACMS missiles that NATO has donated to Ukraine over the past few years. But there's another important advantage of ramjets over traditional artillery: speed. When an artillery shell hits its target, it imparts kinetic energy into the impact, which is directly proportional to its speed. For armor-piercing rounds, the nose is made from high-density alloys, typically steel or tungsten, which directly penetrates the target through sheer kinetic impact. This allows the explosive warhead to be positioned closer to the intended target before it detonates, improving the chances of the explosive blast dealing sufficient damage to the target. This is yet another area where ramjet engines shine compared to the traditional dumb artillery. Typically, the muzzle velocity of a 155mm M777 howitzer is around 827 meters per second, which is approximately Mach 2.5. Once fired, a traditional artillery round starts losing that velocity relatively quickly. In contrast, a ramjet engine begins to kick in at that speed, with air compression and propellant combustion slowly starting to increase as the projectile flies. This allows the ramjet shell to reach its target at speeds far higher than its traditional counterparts, while maintaining the benefit of the increased range. But there's an even bigger reason why the increased range matters so much for modern warfare: safety. The war in Ukraine has cemented the fact that militaries have a far higher operational range than ever before. In particular, the advent of drone warfare and long-range surveillance means that armies can survey enemy positions dozens of miles beyond the front. This means that anything that even approaches the front could, at any point in time, be targeted by drones or even conventional missile and artillery strikes. The combination of artillery and drone warfare is why both sides have such a hard time making any progress throughout the war. The Ukrainian army has a much more developed drone warfare system, with effective kamikaze, first-person view, and anti-tank drones that can pair up to create a consistent and practically insurmountable offensive and defensive system that Russia needs to go through. The artillery then uses the information gathered by drone operators to launch more effective, low to mid-range strikes. For Russia, the concept is similar. Since Russia has much bigger numbers of artillery available, it can focus its efforts on quantity over quality, battering the Ukrainian forces with relentless artillery strikes to create consistent pressure. Furthermore, both sides of the conflict are developing and redeveloping new avenues of electronic warfare, mainly to counter the drones that the opposing side is fielding. That's partially why drones and artillery have remained one of the few consistent parts of engagement. Drones are a practical necessity for both sides due to their ability to perform both surveillance and offensive missions. On the other hand, artillery is one of the few longer-range systems that doesn't rely on electronics to hit the target. Missiles and other guided ordnance typically have some sort of electronics that can be tampered with externally to reduce their accuracy. Traditional artillery doesn't, bypassing the entire electronic warfare aspect. But as mentioned, traditional artillery has a significant range limitation, meaning the artillery batteries and howitzers need to be put perilously close to the front line. Even with a significant numerical advantage, Russian artillery can be taken out by either opposing artillery or longer-range strikes premeditated by drone surveillance. On the other hand, ramjet artillery can be deployed at a much greater distance from the front. The artillery is then protected by simply being out of range of conventional artillery and drone strikes, while still packing enough punch to be an effective offensive weapon. This means that Ukraine could, at least in theory, position its artillery batteries much closer to its defense systems. This would result in Russia needing to use its long-range capabilities, such as military drones and missile strikes, to mount meaningful pressure on Ukrainian artillery. That's something that Russia has been slowly losing throughout the war, as the main supplier of Russian drones, Iran, doesn't have nearly as much manufacturing capability to satisfy Russia's increasing demand. The addition of ramjet artillery, which started in May 2024 with early prototypes, would allow Ukraine to divest some of its forces from protecting artillery and moving them to the front line, thereby creating a more coherent defensive line. This would force Russia to use more of its short-range artillery on the front, which would in turn make them more vulnerable to Ukrainian drone strikes. Additionally, ramjet artillery being able to outrange traditional artillery allows them to win out in artillery against artillery tactics. The simple range advantage means that Ukraine would practically always get the chance to perform the first strike. But there's yet another aspect of ramjet artillery that might make it valuable for Ukraine: long-range diversity. Until relatively recently, Ukraine had a distinct range of disadvantages in the war. The Ukrainian military received a relatively limited supply of long-range missiles that could be used to strike deeper into Russian territory. Oftentimes, these missiles were used to demolish vital supply lines in the occupied part of Ukraine, stalling the Russian advance. However, that changed when Ukraine created a robust drone warfare industry. Beyond using smaller commercial drones for low-range operations close to the front line, Ukraine has also developed and tested various longer-range drone designs that could emulate the Iranian drones that Russia has been using since the very start of the invasion. The effect of these improvements has given Ukraine the ability to mount a large-scale drone attack all the way to Moscow, which is around 400 miles away from the Ukrainian border. The attack, which took place on September 10th, showcased that Ukraine did actually possess the ability to pressure Russian military complexes, industrial centers, and even population centers, all while remaining relatively safe from counterattack. The second advancement in long-range performance came much more recently when the administration of President Joe Biden allowed Ukraine to use the donated ATACMS missiles directly against Russia. The announcement, which came on November 18th, was succeeded by Ukraine launching 6 of those missiles into Russia's military stockpiles. But both systems have inherent downsides. The drone warfare system, as mentioned, relies heavily on electronic systems, meaning that Russia can, and likely has, developed a system to scramble the signals that drones need for guidance and targeting. Secondly, a military drone typically moves at speeds around 250 miles per hour, with faster varieties going around 500 miles per hour at most. These speeds are significantly below Mach 1, which is 741 miles per hour. This means that an anti-air defense system usually has no problems tracking and taking relatively slow drones out of the skies. This is a frequent occurrence on both sides of the war, as only a small percentage of long-range drone strikes actually manage to hit and damage their targets. The ATACMS system suffers from an entirely different issue: supply. While the ability to conduct long-range precision strikes into Russian territory is likely to be a great boon to the Ukrainian forces, allowing them to project more power from a greater distance, there's only a limited amount of these missiles available for use. According to the most recent reports, NATO had only donated about 50 ATACMS missiles. Of course, the US calls its deliveries significant, as each ATACMS missile is extremely costly and a great strategic resource by itself. However, NATO hasn't sent the most modern ATACMS missiles to Ukraine, or at least not entirely. The first significant batch of missiles was composed entirely of older models, which had an effective range of only 100 miles. In comparison, the newer missiles can reach up to 190 miles. Considering that longer-range ATACMS cost more than $1 million per unit, based on a contract from the manufacturer Lockheed Martin, the Kyiv Post posited that Ukraine received no more than a few dozen ATACMS in the most recent $300 million package. And even that number might be slightly elevated. With Ukraine using 1 or 2 ATACMS over several strikes throughout the war, the actual remaining supply is probably around a few dozen missiles. Out of those, it's uncertain how many of the long-range missiles Ukraine has, as 6 of them were likely used in the most recent strike into Russia. This paves the way for the Ramjet prototypes to become the third option for long-range strike capacity. Furthermore, since the Ramjet artillery shells that Norway and Germany are sending are in 155mm rounds, the actual artillery battery is the same as the one that launches traditional artillery shells, with only minimal modifications. While there's no precise information on how many Ramjet artillery rounds have made it to Ukraine, the German company Rheinmetall has suggested that it'll likely start ramping up production soon. Before the war started, Rheinmetall was producing 70,000 artillery shells per year. By 2024, its production capacity increased to between 400 and 500,000 shells annually, with plans to ramp that up to 700,000 shells per year across its European plants by 2025. The company ultimately aims to achieve a median manufacturing capacity of 1.1 million rounds annually, which would nearly double NATO's artillery round production. The company released a statement in 2022 that said it would supply Ukraine with at least 100,000 artillery shells throughout 2024. At least 225 of those were confirmed to be Volcano high-precision rounds. Volcano are the precursors to the Ramjet rounds, using the aforementioned internal self-propellant mechanism that resulted in a range of 45 to 50 miles. However, there is practically no information on exactly how many Ramjet rounds the company has already provided to Ukraine, nor any meaningful reports of how many are being planned for production. Still, having more than 200 artillery shells with more range than its Russian counterparts would allow Ukraine to significantly diversify its long-range tactics. It showcases that NATO is confident that even these weapons should be enough for Ukraine to create meaningful progress and utilize them effectively on the front. This diversification comes at exactly the right time for Ukraine too. Russia has started amping up its efforts in both Donbass and Kursk. Over the past few months, Russia has managed to occupy another 500 square miles of territory in Donbass, creating ample forward momentum for its army through long-range drone and missile strikes deeper into Ukrainian territory. Similarly, Russia has managed to overtake around half of the territory that Ukraine occupied in Kursk. Even more importantly, Russia has started deploying North Korean soldiers who arrived in Kursk in mid-October. Ukrainian intelligence suggests that North Koreans are probably not going to make a significant difference in the grand scale of the conflict. This is because the North Koreans don't have the necessary training and equipment to compete with the modern drone-oriented tactics prevalent in Kursk. Ukraine posits that the casualty rate for the North Korean troops could be as high as 90%, meaning that of the 11,000 or so troops confirmed to be in Kursk, only slightly more than 1,000 are expected to survive the war. Still, those 11,000 soldiers are bodies that the Ukrainian military has to go through if it plans to successfully repel the Russian counteroffensive in Kursk, which was estimated to contain roughly 50,000 troops at one point. This will likely give the Russian military enough justification to divert even more troops to the front line in Donbass. Effectively, the North Koreans are a diversion from the real front line in Ukraine, yet the Ukrainian military can't afford to ignore it. But Ukraine is facing yet another, perhaps even more important problem: the change of US administration. With President Donald Trump now back in the White House, there's a possible shakeup in how the US administration, or particularly foreign policies, will shape the conflict. In his first term, Trump had a much more positive opinion both toward Russia and North Korea than the rest of the Western world, going so far as to become the first US president to visit North Korea. This could lead to Trump reversing some of the policies the Biden administration had enacted, especially the ones concerning sending weapons and financial aid to Ukraine. Additionally, Trump was previously a vocal opponent of the US remaining in NATO, particularly due to a majority of the members failing to meet the recommended national defense budgets for years. This issue has been solved on most counts, with Central European nations such as Germany and Poland injecting their militaries and NATO with billions of dollars. Meanwhile, Sweden and Finland have joined NATO, and both have significant military spending and weapon development capacity. However, there's no telling whether that will be enough for Trump and how he will guide US policy in the years to come. That's why Putin has been gearing up to make more offensive moves, going so far as to start a new round of nuclear saber-rattling, this time in response to the use of ATACMS missiles. For now, though, Trump's policies seem to not interfere with the order of things much, as the US aid to Ukraine hasn't ended. But Trump has noted that he has some plans on approaching a peace deal, and unlike previously, he seems to be more vocally opposed to Putin. He's noted that the war should have never happened, and that he could have ended it in a few days back in 2022 if he were in office. However, there's no telling whether Trump's plans will go in Ukraine's favor. The added long-range capacity that Ukraine has been developing, and which has been donated by Norway and Germany, can provide them some short-term relief. It would allow Ukraine to prove that it can still put up meaningful opposition to Russia's offensive, which could win it some negotiation points with Trump. But regardless of how exactly the war in Ukraine progresses, there are few signs it will end in 2025. The addition of new artillery capabilities can create meaningful changes in military strategies around the world. The new ramjet artillery, if adopted, can make entire systems obsolete, and once again showcase just how far NATO is ahead of its geopolitical opponents. But what do you think? Will the ramjet make an impact on the war in Ukraine?
Germany has just unveiled a new weapon pulled straight out of Russian President Vladimir Putin's worst nightmares. And it gets worse for Putin. That weapon is on its way to Ukraine right now. A massive 6,000 of them, to be precise, with more being promised for the future to allow Ukraine to make its drone advantage over Russia really count. But what is this terrifying new German weapon? Who builds it? And why is Putin so terrified of seeing it make its way onto the battlefield in Ukraine? On February 13th, the drone manufacturer and AI specialist Helsing announced that it was preparing to deliver 6,000 of its HX-2 combat drones to Ukraine. That drone was first unveiled in December 2024, with the highlight being the AI-powered autonomous system that powers the weapon. That system allows multiple HX-2s to pick out targets and attack in volume, all under the control of a single drone operator. Helsing's goal was to balance affordability with operational scalability and precision. In other words, the HX-2 is cheap, accurate, and can be produced in massive volumes. Helsing calls the HX-2 an evolution in autonomous systems, claiming that it has learned from the need for adaptability in the Ukraine war to build a drone that's perfectly suited for Ukraine's needs. The UK's Defence Secretary John Healey spoke at the unveiling, stating, "The Ukraine conflict has demonstrated that a nation's armed forces are only as strong as the industry and innovation behind them. Industrial production doesn't just support good jobs and economic growth, but can determine the outcomes of conflicts and the strength of our deterrence." Healey also announced a $440 million investment into Helsing over the next 5 years, in the wake of the HX-2's unveiling. All of that sounds like a British success story that happens to be beneficial to Ukraine, so where does Germany fit into all of this? Though headquartered in London, Helsing is a multinational company with German origins and a strong European presence. Germany's recent order of 6,000 HX-2s for Ukraine, along with 4,000 HF-1 combat drones in 2024, underscores this connection. Helsing also set up what it calls a resilience factory in southern Germany, which will be responsible for the future production of the HX-2. That factory, combined with Germany's order of the HX-2 for Ukraine, will make Helsing one of the world's largest manufacturers of combat drones. And with that growth will come the ability to build more factories, manufacture more drones, and make Ukraine's war machine a terrifying threat to Putin. It's a true nightmare weapon. And there are several reasons why. When it was first revealed, the HX-2 was touted as a response to Russia's Lancet 3 drones. In some quarters, it was unfairly named a mini Taurus, in reference to the German missile of the same name. But the reality is that the HX-2 is so much more than that. Coming back to Russia's Lancet 3, the HX-2 certainly shares some similarities. It has X-shaped wings like the Lancet, along with similar tail fins. It even shares the same purpose. Both the Lancet and HX-2 are kamikaze drones that are packed with explosives before being sent on their way to their targets. If the HX-2 was a carbon copy of the Lancet, that would still be a boon for Ukraine. Russia's drone is capable of traveling up to 24.8 miles at speeds approaching 68.3 miles per hour. That makes it a fast-moving, albeit short-range weapon that's difficult to shoot out of the air. The Lancet also has a 40-minute battery life, making it ideal for use as a loitering munition that hangs around and then attacks a target as it appears, and it can be used to destroy tanks, armored vehicles, and artillery systems. Add to this a 26.4-pound takeoff weight, which includes 6.6 pounds of explosives, and you have a fairly impressive drone. So how does the HX-2 compare to Russia's drone? It beats it in every aspect that matters, and it incorporates technology that's a long way outside of Putin's reach. That's what makes HX-2 such a devastating weapon and a significant threat to Russian forces. Starting with its range, the HX-2 can travel up to 62 miles. While that isn't far enough to make the drone an effective long-range weapon that can strike into the heart of Russia, it's still more than double the range of the Lancet 3 that it's designed to counter. Helsing's Vice President of Sales for Land Systems, Simon Bruniers, explains why that's so important. HX-2 is specifically designed to operate in so-called dead spaces, that is, at ranges between 30 and 80 kilometers, roughly between 18.6 and 49.7 miles, where conventional drone systems often reach their limits, claims Bruniers. That means HX-2 can go where other short-range drones can't, allowing it to operate in areas where Russian forces might have limited drone defenses. Beyond that, the HX-2 matches the takeoff weight of the Lancet 3, meaning that the warhead it carries will also likely be in the 6.6-pound region. It also has a similar cruising speed to Russia's drone, according to Defense Express, with the big mechanical difference being the HX-2's longer range, which allows it to destroy enemy tanks and artillery behind the front lines of the war. All of this alone would make the HX-2 terrifying for Putin. However, notice that we said mechanical difference just now. We've used that distinction because there's something else the HX-2 delivers that Russia has never seen on the battlefield before: amazing AI software. Although Helsing builds combat drones, its main area of expertise is software development, and it's used software to make HX-2 one of the first truly software-defined drones in existence. The drone's onboard artificial intelligence is completely immune to electronic warfare, or EW tactics that Russia has previously used to throw Ukraine's drones off course. Where in the past Russia could at least defend itself against drone swarms by scrambling their signals, making it impossible for an operator to control them, the HX-2 won't be affected at all. HX-2 will also make it impossible for Russia to detect where drones are coming from. Russia has used EW to locate control stations Ukraine uses to launch its drone attacks. That detection places the stations in line for attacks, ruining their ability to send more drones onto the battlefield and potentially leading to casualties among Ukraine's drone operators. EW has also allowed Russia to cause serious damage to Ukraine's drone stockpiles. According to the Australian Army Research Centre, May 2023 alone saw Russia use EW techniques across every 6.2 miles of the Ukraine war's front lines, allowing it to destroy 10,000 Ukrainian drones in a single month. None of this will happen with HX-2. The onboard AI makes sure of that. Even if signals are disrupted, the drone's AI allows it to continue to search for, re-identify, and engage its targets without any direct instructions from its operator. Of course, operators are still important. The drone informs its operator of every key decision it wants to make, assuming the connection between the operator and drone remains stable. But when that connection is severed, Putin's forces still have to deal with a drone that can attack them autonomously. And it gets even worse for Russia. Complementing the onboard AI is Helsing's Ultra software. That software allows any piece of equipment that has it installed to intelligently communicate with each other. Again, AI is at the forefront. Through this communication, one drone out of a swarm of HX-2s could identify a target and transmit its coordinates to the rest of the drones in the swarm. Those drones all then zero in on the same target, bombarding it with kamikaze attacks. Helsing calls the software a 10 times force multiplier, and it's not wrong. Ultra live streams the data that each HX-2 drone captures, transmitting it to both other drones and the swarm's operator. That makes Ukraine's new drone just as valuable for reconnaissance as it is for kamikaze assaults. Kyiv can use the drone to get an accurate picture of portions of the battlefield that its other drones can't reach, allowing it to organize attacks, while its HX-2 swarms cause chaos. Best of all, Ultra allows a single drone operator to control an entire swarm. So not only does the software create a force multiplier, but it also allows Ukraine to minimize the resources it needs to keep its drones in the air. A single operator can control multiple HX-2s, all loitering from behind the front lines until one of them spots a target. That data is transmitted back to the operator via Ultra, as well as to the other drones, allowing the operator to engage in a large-scale sequential attack on the target. It's an incredibly high-tech system. And it's unlike anything that Putin's forces have faced on the battlefield up to this point. We also have to consider the future ramifications of the Ultra software. Right now, it's installed as standard into every HX-2 drone Ukraine will receive. That's 6,000 drones per the February 13th delivery notice. However, Ukraine has also received 4,000 Helsing HF-1 combat drones. Those could also be equipped with Ultra, creating an even more powerful network of unmanned aerial vehicles for Russia to contend with. If the software is compatible with other Ukrainian drones, or even assets such as artillery units and aerial defense systems, it could transform a huge portion of Ukraine's military hardware into a massive networked system powered by AI. So Russia has to deal with new drones that can communicate with one another and swarm on a target at a moment's notice. And the nightmare only gets even worse for Putin. Do you remember that we mentioned Helsing's plans to build a resilience factory in southern Germany? This isn't a buzzword to Helsing. Each resilience factory is an extremely efficient production facility that allows the nation in which it's built to manufacture Helsing's drones locally. The idea is that each factory gives a nation sovereign control over its means of production. In time, these resilience factories will become the backbone of drone production at scale, at least in the Helsing ecosystem, to allow multiple countries to each build their own HX-2s along with the company's other drones. Why does that matter? The resilience factory Helsing has set up in southern Germany is already capable of producing 1,000 HX-2 drones per month, at a low, albeit undisclosed, cost. That's 1,000 new HX-2s that could make their way into Ukraine every month, building on the already powerful network of 6,000 it has, while replacing any of the drones that get destroyed via kamikaze attacks or Russian aerial defenses on the battlefield. If that wasn't a terrifying enough prospect for Putin, Helsing has no intention of stopping in southern Germany. It plans to build resilience factories across several locations throughout Europe, with the goal of reaching HX-2 production in the tens of thousands of units monthly. Helsing co-founder Gundbert Scherf says, "We are increasing HX-2 production in parallel with new orders. The war in Ukraine shows every day that modern, precise technology can compensate for numerical disadvantages compared to older systems. With our resilience factories, we are focused on decentralized mass production across Europe." Scherf's co-founding partner Nicholas Köhler expands on the point, adding, "We have brought together Europe's brightest minds to develop mass production of the future." It's not just the HX-2 that will torment Putin and his troops on the ground. It's what the drone represents and how it threatens to change the entire complexion of Russia's special military operation that makes it a major game changer. Building on Köhler and Scherf's words, Helsing's resilience factories are just one of many ways that Putin's actions in Ukraine have united the rest of Europe against him. Chatham House highlights this unity, noting that European Union or EU nations were quick to agree on implementing sanctions against Russia in the wake of Putin's invasion. Those sanctions have been built upon since. The EU alone currently levies 2,234 sanctions against Russia, with the UK having 1,918, France implementing 2,175, and Switzerland levying 3,010 separately from the collective. Europe is also united in terms of applying price caps on Russian oil and sending military aid to Ukraine, showcasing a resolve that Putin never expected. He'd hoped that his invasion would cause fractures, with the EU nations getting bogged down among themselves in arguments over how to respond. Instead, he's united much of Europe, particularly the EU and NATO member nations, against him. His actions led to Finland and Sweden pushing to become NATO members so they could benefit from collective defense. They've also served as a wake-up call to several major European powers, including France and Germany, according to Chatham House, that the geopolitical climate of the continent has changed. In short, the war in Ukraine has created a stronger Europe, one that's collectively against Putin and everything he wants to achieve. Helsing and the resilience factories it's building throughout the continent for its HX-2 drones are direct outcomes of that increased unity. Europe is already proposing the creation of a single market for weapons procurement. That's according to Internationale Politik Quarterly, which says the European Commission has proposed a new defense industrial program designed specifically to enable joint purchases. The Commission aims to ensure EU member states jointly purchase at least 40% of their defense equipment from companies that build within Europe, allocating at least half of their procurement budgets to this task in the process. Helsing's new factories feed into those goals. Whether the European Commission's proposals come to fruition remains to be seen, but it's clear that there's a paradigm shift in how Europe's Western-aligned nations deal with Putin in the wake of the invasion. They're no longer willing to handle Russia alone and have realized that the best defense against an imperialistic authoritarian is working together. Helsing's resilience factories are emblematic of that desire and represent a clear message to Putin that he's not just fighting Ukraine anymore. He's dealing with an entire continent that stands against him. The situation doesn't get any better for Putin when we zoom in on the Ukrainian battlefield. Take HX-2's kamikaze capabilities as an example. Ukraine has made extensive use of kamikaze drones throughout much of the war. Every strike against a Russian oil refinery or steel production mill makes use of long-range drones that are packed with explosives and fly directly into their targets in order to destroy them. In December 2024, Le Monde reported on Ukraine's extensive use of the Rubaka drone, which can travel up to 310 miles while carrying an explosive that weighs up to 22 pounds to attack deep into the heart of Russia. It also has much larger kamikaze drones, some capable of traveling double the distance of the Rubaka, that allow Ukraine to hit Moscow itself. These deep-strike kamikaze drones have become one of the most important hallmarks of Ukraine's strategy against Russia, which is why it aims to build 30,000 of them by the end of 2025. Now, with 6,000 HX-2s in its arsenal, along with the potential for at least 1,000 more to arrive per month, Ukraine's short-range kamikaze drone capabilities are just as powerful as its long-range strike capacity. These networked drones ensure that Ukraine has to dedicate fewer operatives to the battlefield, especially given that an entire swarm can be controlled by one person. That leads to less risk when taking out targets just behind the front lines. HX-2s have also sharpened Ukraine's metaphorical sword, because the country is no longer limited to attacking a target with one or two explosive drones. It can send dozens, all working in concert to decimate Russia's tanks and artillery units. Those kamikaze capabilities allow Ukraine's soldiers to weaken Russian offensives before those offensives even reach their fortifications. It all adds up to two things: less pressure on Ukraine and more casualties for Russia. That's going to be devastating to Putin, considering that he's already lost over 855,000 people, more than 10,000 tanks, and over 23,000 artillery systems. The introduction of the HX-2 to Ukraine makes Kyiv more capable of combating Russia's heavy equipment while causing casualties, all at a time when Russia is struggling to maintain its equipment stockpiles. We mentioned that Ukraine plans to build 30,000 deep strike drones just now. Therein lies another reason why the introduction of HX-2 will change the complexion of the battlefield in the war. It further asserts Kyiv's dominance in the drone war. Both sides have made heavy use of drones to conduct long-range strikes and support their troops on the ground. However, Ukraine realized the importance of these unmanned aerial vehicles long before Russia, and its internal manufacturing capacity is more developed as a result. Ukraine is now at the point where it can build 4 million drones per year, with Russia only capable of building 1.4 million. Kyiv can manufacture more than 3 times the number of drones Russia builds. In that context, 6,000 HX-2s might seem like a drop in the ocean. However, when you add those drones coming from external sources to the millions Ukraine is building domestically, you get a recipe for Kyiv ruling the skies above its own country. That's without mentioning the possibility that Helsing may set up one of its resilience factories in Ukraine, delivering more domestic drone manufacturing capacity to the country. Finally, there's the often underappreciated aspect of Ukraine's drone dominance. It allows Ukraine to develop advantages elsewhere on the battlefield. In January 2025, Forbes war reporter David Axe wrote that Ukraine may have finally developed a tank advantage over Russia for the first time since Putin launched his invasion in February 2022. That advantage only extended to some stretches of the 800-mile front line, but Ukraine's ability to manufacture it at all is remarkable, considering just how many more tanks Putin had at his disposal earlier in the war. How did Ukraine create these pockets of tank advantage? It all comes down to drones. As one Russian military blogger put it, The enemy has achieved sufficient scale and variety in its drones and has honed its tactics for their use. Whenever Ukraine has managed to deploy 2 company-sized drone units along with a couple of dozen drone operators near the front line, Russian tanks simply don't reach the line for launching an attack, says the blogger. They're destroyed long before they can engage in any direct assaults. The introduction of HX-2 will only make these preemptive strikes stronger. Ukraine will no longer need to dedicate several dozen operators to its attacks against Russian tanks. It can send 1 or 2, each operating a swarm of AI-powered drones that pack enough of an explosive punch to take out the Russian tanks, and are capable of working together to do so. And even if Russia manages to take out the operators, its tanks and other equipment won't be safe. The HX-2's autonomous attack capabilities make sure of that. With this powerful new German-made drone, Ukraine can potentially build more pockets along the front line where it has superiority on the ground as well as in the drone department. Perhaps that will be the most important thing that HX-2 delivers to Ukraine as the war moves deeper into 2025. But what do you think about HX-2? Is it as impressive as it sounds, and how will Russia try to combat swarms of AI-powered drones when it's already struggling to deal with the drones Ukraine was building before?
You don't typically see Finland making the news when it comes to helping Ukraine. The country has had its own share of problems with Russia, which is understandable when you realize that Finland has the second longest European border with Russia, the first being Ukraine itself. But it seems Finland has finally decided to get its hands dirty by helping Ukraine to end the war directly. How? Let's dig into it. First, you need to understand why the conflict between Ukraine and Russia has lasted so long. The war in Ukraine is considered one of the deadliest conflicts of the 21st century compared to its relatively short duration thus far. This could be attributed to both sides of the conflict using a mixture of old and new technologies. While Russia initially had the tech lead through its more numerous and advanced military, Ukraine has done wonders to catch up, and in some cases overtake it thanks to NATO donations. However, throughout the war, there has been a somewhat odd consistency to what weapons Ukraine received from its Western allies. Sure, NATO has pledged at least $300 billion in aid, according to the most recent statistics from the Kiel Institute for the World Economy. Some sources suggest that the figure has already surpassed $380 billion and is closer to $400 billion instead. This figure includes both bilateral and unilateral aid from the governments of various NATO member states, and encompasses direct military aid in the form of weapons, vehicles, and technology. But what most countries have done to provide that aid is to skim their supplies of soon-to-be obsolete equipment and donate this excess stock to Ukraine. In other words, these supplies were about to get dropped out of use by their respective militaries anyway. Take the base version of the M1 Abrams, which was designed in the 1980s. The tanks donated to Ukraine are more modernized M1A1 and M1A2 tanks that are somewhat comparable to the best versions that the US keeps exclusively for its own armed forces. This was achieved by pulling old tanks out of storage, of which there are roughly 3,500, and retrofitting them with new parts. The result, a Frankenstein-ish M1A1 Abrams made specifically for export to Ukraine. Of course, there's a method to the madness. Donating fresh tanks would require them to be ordered and built from scratch, and the US Army is unlikely to give up its active units. The same principle applies to the airplanes Ukraine has received over the past year. President Zelensky was adamant that the country needed more than 100 F-16 fighter jets to be able to defend itself against the numerically superior Russian air forces. And in early January, several European NATO countries pulled their F-16s and sent them to Ukraine. These were only donated because they were being replaced by F-35s in the donor countries. The F-16 isn't that modern anymore, as the planes given to Ukraine needed several modifications to be able to accommodate new surveillance systems and weapons that NATO has provided. Which brings us back to how the Nordic countries are going to do things differently. Over the summer of 2024, Finland announced that it would be switching gears. The most recent round of military aid from Finland to Ukraine, the 25th time Finland has sent weapons or equipment to Ukraine, would include advanced weapons prototypes instead of existing designs. The news came directly from the Finnish Defence Force Arms Chief Mikko Heiskanen. According to Heiskanen, Finland will send top-secret classified projects to Ukraine for real-world testing. The Finnish Defence Force claims that the experience gained on the battlefields in Ukraine will help shape the latest Finnish equipment. In turn, this should increase demand for these weapons from other countries, boosting Finland's prospects of becoming a notable arms and equipment supplier to NATO and beyond. Of course, due to the projects being classified, we're in the dark as to what's being sent to the Ukrainian military or how much of it. The wording of Heiskanen's report mentions that the latest batch of donations will serve the interests of both Ukraine's and Finland's military. What does this mean exactly? Well, for one, it's highly likely that Finland has already exhausted its stockpile of spare or obsolete equipment that it could comfortably send to Ukraine. This might not be such a bad thing though. It implies that the Finnish military mostly uses newer weapons and believes that these will be enough to face any potential Russian aggression. The second reason why Finland is likely not sending its own stock of weapons is familiarity, or more precisely, Ukraine's lack of it. The Ukrainian research network New Geopolitics has implied that Ukraine would gladly take any piece of Soviet-era weaponry and systems it could get, but had to be more selective with NATO equivalents. With Ukraine having had its military structured and equipment based on old Soviet designs, its soldiers were trained to use them. The same is not true for contemporary Western systems, at least not yet. A donation of Western-designed weapons only means that the Ukrainian army would have to take the time to retrain its troops to use them. This would cost them too much time and initiative in the war, especially while they are fully engaged trying to repel a major Russian onslaught. Thirdly, we need to go back to the first part of the report from the Finnish defense chief. Finland is sending neither old equipment nor existing gear, it's sending prototypes of future weapons. The war in Ukraine is one of the few opportunities Western countries have to witness how their weapons fare on a relatively even playing field. For example, the war on terror involved many NATO countries sending their troops and equipment to the Middle East. However, they had a significant military technology advantage over Iraq and Afghanistan, where the Taliban and the insurgents mainly used unmodified Soviet-era systems. The US could exercise almost complete air dominance over these countries, especially in Afghanistan, which had practically no air defenses in place. In Ukraine, the situation is very different. Russia is considered to have some of the most advanced military systems in the world, especially in terms of anti-air defenses and long-range artillery. Russian self-propelled artillery vehicles can fire at nearly twice the rate of contemporary Western designs. Even if they're not as effective in terms of accuracy or pure firepower, Russia can compensate for that with sheer numbers. By some estimates, Russia is able to manufacture over 3 million artillery rounds per year. On the other hand, the entirety of NATO could only cobble together just over 1 million shells to send to Ukraine in a year by relying solely on new production and procurement from various countries in the global south. Sending more would mean that the West would have to dip into its existing stocks, which could take years to be replenished. The comparable technological levels between Russia and Ukraine, at least in some areas, are exactly why the battlefields in Ukraine are so useful for Western analysts. Watching how the theory compares to reality is critical in showcasing the Western weapons that excel in modern warfare. But even more importantly, it can shine a spotlight on technology or equipment that is less useful than its cost and investment imply. A good example of this is the prevalence of drone warfare. Both Russia and Ukraine have developed several parallel systems that use small commercial drones designed for video making or agriculture as the base for military drones. Drones that were initially intended for pro-photography have been pivotal in giving military officers an eye in the sky that costs less than $1,000 per piece, a price so low that it's practically inconceivable in the US military industry. Agricultural drones were repurposed by Ukraine into the so-called vampire or Baba Yaga drone. Instead of fertilizing equipment, these drones now carry mortar shells and mines, which they drop directly onto enemy infantry or fortifications. The drones add yet another dimension to modern war strategies, one where real-time monitoring and response are practically a given. This has resulted in towed artillery systems like the howitzers hailing from the Soviet era, which both sides of the war are using, only being useful in significant numbers. The howitzers need to be deployed, fire, and then be disassembled before moving. This process takes time, during which they are practically sitting ducks if the enemy can use a few drones to determine their positions. And with more modernized drones equipped with the capacity for excellent night vision and infrared detection, there aren't many places for stationary weapons to hide. To remain relevant in the warfare of the future, there are two possible avenues of progress for these weapons. They'll either need advanced camouflage or hit-and-run functionality. The Swedes seem to have taken charge of the former, with advanced Barracuda camo systems being pioneered in Ukraine. The HIMARS systems have proven to be an excellent example of the latter. The self-propelled anti-air missile launcher can start relocating within minutes of firing a salvo. Considering the average HIMARS armament spends only a minute and a half in the air, Russia doesn't have enough time to both respond to the missile and track down the truck that fired it. So with all these improvements in mind, what's Finland's contribution to the cause? As mentioned, the official news outlet and the defense ministry are tight-lipped. Considering that the projects are supposedly still in the prototype phase, it's likely that we'll need to wait years for more announcements, likely to only come after the war in Ukraine ends one way or another. But we can fish for some clues in the meantime. Finland's largest weapons manufacturer, at least domestically, is Patria. It's a defense contractor majority owned by the Finnish government, with the other 49.9% owned by the Norwegian defense group Kongsberg Defence and Aerospace AS. Patria has been responsible for delivering several contemporary systems to the national defense sectors in Finland and abroad. Some of these systems have even been seen on the Ukrainian battlefields. The first example is the Patria AMV, or Armored Modular Vehicle, an 8x8 multi-role vehicle. The key advancement in Patria's designs lies in its ability to incorporate various weapon systems and technologies. Depending on the configuration, the AMV can serve as an armored personnel carrier, infantry support vehicle, or medical support vehicle. To this end, there are a few variations of the specific chassis that the AMV can use. High roof models are used for command and transport, while heavy armament models are used for attaching weapon systems. The AMV also has a more robust armor plating system, designed to withstand most common anti-tank mines, such as the ubiquitous TM62s that both Ukraine and Russia have used throughout the war. Patria has exported its AMV designs to Poland, modifying them to reduce the armor but add on amphibious operation capabilities. One of the possible avenues of improvement for this AMV system comes from the aforementioned failures of towed artillery. In particular, Patria also makes a 155mm towed gun howitzer with a high fire rate of 6 rounds per minute and an ability to self-propel short distances via an integrated diesel engine and a wheeled platform. Patria has previously experimented with mounting the howitzer onto a Soviet T-55 tank chassis. However, the resulting weapon experienced difficulties with reduced accuracy after being redeployed and the barrel's erratic behavior during longer-range shots. While Finland hasn't sent any of the Patria-made 155mm gun howitzers to Ukraine, at least according to official reports, Finland has sent some of its stock of towed gun artillery. These include the Soviet 2A36 Jayastint B 152mm and M46 130mm howitzers. With both being Soviet designs, Ukraine could readily make good use of them due to its domestic artillery manufacturing capabilities. This was likely Finland's way of clearing out obsolete stock. This would imply that the country also has sent its remaining supply of ammunition for these weapons, as its newer 150mm guns can consistently use ammo made for pretty much any other NATO-based design. Additionally, the Finnish news agency Yle reported in 2023 that Patria was considering creating new AMVs in Ukraine, using Ukraine's domestic manufacturing resources under license from Patria. This implied that the AMVs have performed favorably in Ukraine so far, likely due to their modular designs and opportunity for future modifications. The latter has been one of the key ways that Ukraine has stayed ahead of Russia during the war. Therefore, it's possible that Finland is looking into the possibility of using Patria AMV chassis as the base for domestic self-propelled gun howitzers based on the Patria artillery. The result will likely be heavily inspired by the French truck-mounted gun howitzer Caesar. The Caesar also uses a 155mm howitzer as the armament, but the entire system uses a 6x6 truck as the base. Patria's alterations could include the AMV's robust armor plating system or the added reliability and carrying capacity of the 8x8 chassis. This advancement is supported by the fact that the Caesars have outperformed both the US-made tracked M109A6 Paladin and the British-towed M777, which both use the 155mm cannons. While roughly a third of the tracked artillery donated to Ukraine has been lost to the Russian offensive, only a tenth of the donated Caesars have been destroyed so far. This implies that the added mobility from putting the gun on a wheeled chassis drastically improves its survivability, emphasizing the need for hit-and-run tactics for mid- to long-range systems. The second vehicle that Patria has donated to Ukraine is the Pacey Armored Personnel Carrier. Unlike the AMV, the Pacey is a 6-wheeled, lightly armored, fully amphibious vehicle. In a 2023 report, at least 20 Pacey models were sent to Ukraine by the end of that year. Similarly to the AMV, the Pacey XA180 and the XA185 don't have native armament systems. However, the vehicle has a rotating turret base, which accepts an autocannon or a machine gun to transform it into an infantry support vehicle. However, there are not many reports about the vehicle's performance in Ukraine. Patria's upgrades to the Pacey seem to end with the XA200 series, which was designed with heavier armor. This caused the vehicle to lose its fully amphibious operational capacity, only allowing it to wade into 5-foot deep water instead. The XA202 is primarily used as a communications and command vehicle and is currently fielded by both the Finnish and Swedish armed forces. A report in February 2022 indicates that Patria was in the process of upgrading the Swedish vehicles to improve their intended lifespan for another couple of decades. The upgrades were supposed to take place until 2025. Patria might use the real-life experience of the XA-185's performance in Ukraine to course-correct the improvements to the existing XA-202s. Finally, Patria has recently announced an upgraded mobile 120mm mortar system named Tremos. The design of the Tremos uses traditional heavy mortar armaments integrated into a modular carriage system, similar to what the AMVs might use, and then mounted on a military truck. The Tremos system is supposedly compatible with 4x4, 6x6, 8x8, and even tracked vehicles due to its improved recoil reduction capability, which should improve the truck's stability and curb some wear and tear. One of the hallmarks of the Tremos is its hit-and-run capability, allowing the vehicle to open fire after only a minute of setup and leave immediately after the last mortar is fired. It could potentially have been inspired by improvements to existing systems and is, in a sense, an acknowledgement that this type of technology has proved most useful in the war in Ukraine. But why does a future vehicle matter if Ukraine's problem is in the present? Well, Tremos is supposed to enter production in early 2025. Considering that it's become highly unlikely that the war will end anytime soon, Finland might start actively producing the system for the sole purpose of immediately sending it to Ukraine. This might not be pure conjecture either. Consider the previously mentioned report from June 2024, where the Finnish Defense Ministry suggested that it's already sending prototypes to Ukraine. These might include precursors or prototypes of the Tremos. Tremos might also get its first field tests in Ukraine, allowing Patria to gain valuable experience of the system's functionality and success rates. Remember, Russia has some of the most robust defensive systems in the world and is Finland's direct neighbor. In a hypothetical scenario where Russia attacks any NATO country, Finland would have no choice but to join the conflict. Furthermore, Heiskanen mentioned that some production capacity reserved for domestic arms manufacturing could be used to create more weapons for Ukraine. Heiskanen urged that this would require political will and funding from the Finnish government, the majority owner of the Patria Defense Group. Thus, the process goes full circle, and the Finnish government controls both the arms manufacturer and the means to send more weapons to Ukraine. And considering that Finland's relations with Russia have taken a sharp downturn in recent years, its government might just be emboldened enough to make more aggressive and public movements. Immediately after the war in Ukraine started in February 2022, Russia seemed to try to undermine the Finnish government and economy. In a BBC report from November 2023, Finnish officials claimed that Russia was trying to overwhelm the Finno-Russian border by sending illegal migrants from Syria, Iraq, and Yemen all the way from the south of Russia to Scandinavia. In response, Finland closed most of its border crossings with Russia in 2024 and enacted a law to block asylum seekers coming from Russia. The law, which runs contrary to Finland's previous commitments to international human rights efforts, is one of the more public ways in which Finland has responded to what it perceives as Russia's efforts to undermine it. In late 2023, Russia had already passed the torch of breaking down relations by refusing to renew a border agreement with Finland that had been in place since 2012. The hybrid warfare tactic that Russia is employing inside Finland is effectively a direct response to Finland joining NATO in 2023, which itself is a response to Russia annexing Crimea in 2014 and then fully invading Ukraine in 2022. As such, it's understandable that Finland, with its own history of war against Russia in the 20th century, would be wary of its aggressive neighbor. Now, Finland might have the opportunity to step up its support for Ukraine further. With the August 2024 invasion of the Russian region of Kursk, Ukraine has again stepped over one of Russia's so-called nuclear red lines without a response. Remember the F-16s we talked about at the start of the video? They were partially delayed because Putin had threatened that their deployment in Ukraine might be just cause for Russia to use nukes against NATO members supplying them. When that didn't happen, Russia threatened that the supply of weapons enabling Ukraine to strike into Russia would be considered the same way. Then the Kursk incursion came and Russia's response took a while to gather steam. Ukraine has already managed to strike Moscow in large-scale drone attacks, albeit causing minimal damage. Finland and Sweden have already started sending some of their more modern equipment to Ukraine. If Finland decides that it's actually time for Russia to get out of Ukraine, the steps are clear. Mobilize domestic arms production to deliver more modern weapons to the Ukrainian army. Will this happen? The current prototype testing going on in Ukraine indicates it just might. After that, it's up to Finland and NATO to keep finding ways to try and push Russia into submission. But what do you think? How far is Finland willing to go against Russia? And what other weapons might the Finns send to Ukraine? Let us know in the comments below, and thank you for watching.